Hallelujah. Let Lord Jesus Christ shine forth. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us. Welcome to another live stream with DCCI Ministries to talk about how Quran is from Allah. I know you all need to kind of think and make sure you heard that correctly. Make sure it passed through your ears. Yes, we will be talking about providing some proofs actually how Quran is from Allah. And to do this, actually, behind the screens, we do have a gentleman who decided to kind of put himself to hell by converting Islam, who is going to make his case. And also, I have reasoned answers. Peace of Christ be with you, brother.
Peace of Christ be with you. Thrilled to be
How
here
are you
today.
doing, brother?
I am doing well, blessed by the love of our Lord Jesus, our living Lord Jesus. Feel his love every day.
What have you been up to? What's going on these days with you?
Yeah, I've done a lot on my channel recently. Been doing mostly live streams, had on a variety of interesting guests, had on some Muslims to try to give their arguments for Islam or for various other things. I've had a Muslim on arguing that the Quran affirms the crucifixion of Jesus, appropriate topic for Easter weekend for sure. And then, of course, I had a hangout for apologists. It was supposed to be on this channel, but Hatun couldn't make it. So I picked that up on my channel, and that was a lot of fun. Ended up going for 14 hours, which was a record. The YouTube will only allow you to store 12 hours, so I had to stop it and restart it to finish the stream. Had on a whole bunch of guests, including David Wood on that, and got to talk to a number of Muslims as well.
Thanks for stepping in and doing that live stream, brother. Really appreciate for that. I really appreciate. What do you think, or what do you think? How many brain cells someone must lose to come to the conclusion that Quran is from Allah? And not only like lose brain cells to come to that conclusion, but loses extra brain cells and then makes a video about it. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. It would take a lot because the arguments he ends up giving, and to be clear, I'll discuss the individual here in a minute. But to be clear, I don't actually think he converted because of the arguments he presents in the video. That he converted for some other reason, which he didn't specify, and then he found this proof afterwards. He presents 5 arguments in this video. His 5 conclusive proofs that Islam is the truth. The video was titled A Convert Proves That the Quran Comes from God in 45 minutes. Way less than 45 minutes of actual content in that. In addition to the poor arguments, it also is very poorly produced. There's a lot of times where he doesn't say anything in the video for 30 seconds. And yet, despite all of this, the arguments being some standard things that most Muslims probably are aware of, and thus not very good arguments, and the poor production value, despite that, this video went viral on YouTube. YouTube recommended the video to me. I saw it. I skimmed it to know what the gist of the arguments were, primarily focusing on mathematical miracles, or what are really mathematical coincidences in the Quran. And thus I contacted the individual, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But you'll see today I have on my pi shirt. Might not be that easy to see. It's kind of dark, but it actually has the digits of pi written out in the shape of a pi symbol. One of my multiple math nerd shirts, and maybe we'll find out why I have math nerd shirts in a minute here. Normally I wear one of my Jesus shirts, as my family calls them during these streams, but today I'm wearing a different shirt wearing the pi symbol.
So thank you for, actually I shouldn't be saying thank you because it was painful. Thank you. What else I could say instead of thank you? Anyways, thank you for bringing the video to our attention as well. Um, I'm sorry, I'm not as patient as you are. I couldn't watch it. It was very, very painful. Instead of like suffering a couple of times, I think like suffering once for all will be better. So probably lots of part of this video I will be watching for the first time. So video is taken from YouTube video called "A Convert Proves the Quran is from God" within 45 minutes. We are using this video in intention of critiquing it. None of us right now in this live stream believes Quran is from Allah at all. But that was the title of the video. And of course, it makes sense why YouTube is recommending such a video, because anything makes Islam look good, anything helps converts to make money and set up YouTube channel is always good for YouTube. So the way we are going to follow this live stream is there will be some PowerPoint slides as well as short clips we will be watching, and brother is going to make comments or critique it. There will be the times probably I will jump in. And those of you who are joining us in the chat, if you want to get our attention, then please put @ in front of DCCI Ministries, and then hopefully I'll see them and then bring your questions. And if you feel as a Muslim you can make a case, such a case, and defend the Quran or help your new brother out, brother, would you be okay if they want to call in? And, you can call in. Just you need to express that in the chat, call in, and then we will give you a platform to justify such a stupid claims. Of course, if you think, no, I want to stay away from this claim, that's absolutely fine. So before I start, let me just summarize something for us. As a Christian, Bible makes it very clear, and it all points to Lord Jesus Christ. A couple of days ago, we celebrated his death and his resurrection, who walked out of that grave, and today he rules and reigns. Bible is about Lord Jesus Christ, his work of Messiah, and his identity. I don't need any other prophet to come. I do not need any other book to come and then tell me about Jesus or about any coming prophet. Lord Jesus Christ finished his work once for all. Bible is sufficient enough. I don't need another book. I don't need another prophet at all. Sadly, in 21st century, there are people who kind of decides, oh yeah, let me find another book to justify what I believe, what I do. That video is going to be this video is going to be one of them. Quran makes a claim that this is apparently from, if this is not from Allah, produce something like this. So mathematical arguments, what we are going to watch in this video, in these short clips, I want to remind all of you, has nothing to do with the Allah's criteria or the criteria of Muhammad, that this book is from Allah. Nothing at all. Muhammad was very bad with maths. Allah is very bad with maths. And even current Quran with its forms, depend Hafs Quran or Warsh Quran, whichever you pick, mathematical miracle work differently for both of them. As well as manuscripts is another case. Traditional account of the compilation of the Quran is another case. Mathematical miracles won't work with that, because Mr. Muslim is going to make a case that Quran is from Allah with all these mathematical miracles. I am assuming he's using 1980s Quran with the English translation of it. Has nothing to do with Quran which Muhammad claimed to receive, or has nothing to do with the 10th century or 11th century manuscripts at all. And as I said, it is not the criteria of Quran itself. Brother, anything you want to kind of just summarize before I put your PowerPoints or I put your videos up?
Yeah, I think that more or less covers everything. I would just say try your best to approach the material with an open mind, whether you're a Christian, Muslim, or otherwise, because the truth should be apparent. We don't need these fancy arguments. So we don't need skilled rhetoric to see the truth. So if what I say doesn't make sense and it's false, then by all means, don't listen to what I have to say. But if it does make sense, if these mathematical miracles don't hold up to scrutiny, then stop using that argument if you're a Muslim, and find a real argument, because not to give it away, but people do the same kind of thing with the Bible sometimes. They get to the Bible and they find these mathematical patterns in it. And Christians mostly pay no attention to that because we have better evidence for the truth of our religion than playing games by manipulating numbers.
So we can check the reliability of the Christian scripture or its truthfulness within scripture by itself, through archaeology, through history. So sadly, Islam steps in and then kind of introduces, it's not Islam actually, I think Muslims come up. They needed to defend the Quran to be word of Allah, because they are very much aware, even though Quran claims to be the confirmation of the previous religions, it doesn't do that. Quran contradicts the history. Therefore, they can't say history is wrong. They need to come up with new things to make sure people forget those arguments. But don't fall into those things. Don't fall into those things. So, brother, whenever you are ready, just let me know. I can put PowerPoints or
go ahead and put the PowerPoint up. Just a couple words of introduction on that before we get the first clip from the Muslim convert. So today we're going to be...
Your PowerPoint slides are like very nice, actually.
So today we're going to be looking at the miraculous Quran. We're going to be seeing all the great reasons why you should all convert to Islam. Oh, wait, hold on a second. Let me fix that slide. We're going to be debunking all the miraculous claims that people make about the Quran. Obviously, we're not debunking every claim that someone has made. There is an unlimited number of these claims, but we're going to be looking at 5 popular ones that this particular convert decided to highlight. So first, we're going to meet Elijah. That is the convert's name. If you want to play the first video.
Please make sure everyone is ready. It's going to be painful.
How I know that the Quran is a revelation from God. So I've created this presentation, inshallah, to show in simple, straightforward terms, and with the appropriate sources once again, how I know that the Quran is a revelation from God.
So if you want to put the PowerPoint back up, that was just a couple words from him describing the purpose of his video in his own words. A little bit about him. I didn't play this portion of it. He did talk for a minute or two about himself. He said that he converted to Islam a couple months ago. The video was released in February, so I would assume somewhere around the turn of the new year is when he converted to Islam. He doesn't state his reasons in the video, but he does say, after I became a convert, I discovered this information and wanted to share it with people. So I assume that the stuff in the video has nothing to do with his conversion. I don't know why he converted. In his viral video, a convert proves the Quran is from God in 45 minutes. It has attracted... When I downloaded it some time ago, it had like 40,000 views. It's probably over 100,000 views by now. Many Muslims going on to this and saying how miraculous it was and how he affirmed their faith. And if everyone just viewed this same information, then they would all convert as well. So I reached out to Elijah. I emailed him. I found his contact information on his page. Said very politely, very friendly, I came across your video. YouTube recommended it to me. I would like to give you the opportunity to come and discuss your video with me live. He declined that invitation, saying that he didn't want to give a platform to a critic of Islam because he didn't want to have a debate. So I emailed back. I explained to him that I was offering to let him come on my channel, which at the time I had about 15,000 subscribers, and he had like 2,000 subscribers at the time. He's now up to like 8,000 or something. But and he didn't email me back. However, in that first email, he said that he would answer any question that I asked him via email. He just didn't want to, give me a platform, as silly as that excuse was. So I emailed him a second time after he ignored that, or a third time technically, a second reply to his reply. And I said, be aware that I'm going to critique your video whether you come on and talk to me live or not. And if you don't come on and talk to me live, I'm going to be a lot harsher on your video than I would be if we were having a friendly conversation. And then I gave him several questions. I said, even if you're unwilling to do that, will you please answer these questions via email? He ignored that email as well, despite his previous one that said he would be happy to answer any questions that I had about his video. So here we are. I'm not going to be very kind to his video because he did not have the confidence to defend his own claims.
There is something called like keyboard jihadis. Have you heard that phrase? So they don't know anything about their faith. They would put up a video to critique other faiths, or kind of just lie and then put up a video which will get views, and then sit at home and then use the keyboard to just like do dawah. Such situations are very common. But after you are offering him to, giving him platform actually to come and do this nonsense thing, I am kind of just surprised that he rejected you, brother.
Yeah, if a Muslim contacted me and said they wanted to have a chat on their channel, I would agree to do that because, well, one, I would love to be in front of a Muslim audience. I love talking to Christians, but I'd rather talk to Muslims and bring this material to them. Obviously, some Muslims come to our channels, but I could definitely reach more Muslims on a Muslim channel. So I would love that opportunity. He supposedly believes Islam is the truth. He supposedly proved, that's how he titled his video. He proves that the Quran is from God. If it's actually proof, he should be eager to defend it. And who knows, maybe he'll win hundreds of converts and win all kinds of rewards from Allah. But he doesn't want to do that. I can only conclude that he isn't actually confident in his arguments.
Yep, it's not that difficult to come to that conclusion, brother. Okay. Should I put another video? What's
one more slide? A little bit about myself, why I'm qualified to answer this particular video. As you've already heard, my channel is Reasoned Answers. It's devoted to intellectually defending the Christian faith as well as outreach to Muslims. Me personally, I've always been very fascinated with numbers and statistics, even when I was a young child. I have memories of like taking like a random ad that came in the mail or whatever, and like literally counting how many A's were in it, how many B's were in it, and comparing the frequency of the letters for no reason whatsoever, other than I thought it was interesting and neat. A very weird thing to do, I know. I was kind of a mathematical prodigy. I don't say this to brag. I say this to make it clear where I'm coming from. But in when I was in middle school, when they started having, the divided math, the way it works in the United States is everyone has the same math up until a certain grade level. And then you start having divided math where kids who are more advanced go to a more advanced class. Anyway, they quickly discovered that I was grasping the math much quicker than a normal kid would, and they started advancing me in grade level. So I was doing most of my classes with kids my own age, but I was doing math with older kids, and eventually took some classes at the high school while I was still in middle school. And then when I was in high school, I took classes in college, primarily math, because I was very good at math. I was very fascinated by math. And eventually I got my bachelor's degree in actuarial science. Actuarial science is part of the mathematics department. Actuaries are the people who set insurance rates. So it's all about probability. It's all about numbers. It's all about understanding what is likely and what is unlikely. In business or in insurance, there's a saying of a black swan event. This is a very unlikely event that is also very disastrous. And this is kind of exactly what insurance is, right? It's to protect you from that very unlikely event. And it's very unlikely that, say, a tornado will hit my house. But if it does, it's extremely devastating. So if I pay a small amount of money and they spread that risk out over all, thousands of different people, hundreds of thousands of people, very low cost to be protected against that catastrophic event. So I understand probability is what I'm getting at. I worked as an actuary for several years, and I now work as a data analyst, which is a similar idea. I'm manipulating data on a daily basis. So when a Muslim wants to discuss the mathematical miracles of the Quran, I am eager to jump at that subject. So if you want to go ahead and play the second video, this one, he starts his argument by doing something that Muslims often do, which is try to make Muhammad into a total loser.
Okay, just let me say, since kind of you brought up your background, why I am qualified to talk about this video is because I'm Christian and Islam is false ideology. As a Christian, I am told to critique and demolish all the false ideologies for the kingdom of God. So that's what is my background. I don't have that much fancy things in my background. All I know is Islam is false religion, and the beauty of Lord Jesus Christ affects every heart and transforms every heart and wants every heart to turn to him. So therefore, I'll step in. So now I've got a couple of problems here. I've got 3 videos. I'm not sure which one I need to click first. I'll go with the first one. This might be something we listened before. If that is the case, I'll just move to the second one. So it might be a little bit practical problems from this side, okay?
I created this presentation, inshallah, to show in simple, straightforward terms, and with the appropriate sources once again, how I know that the Quran is a revelation from God. Context, in Mecca, in Arabia, during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the measurement, like when people describe people as being wealthy back then in that part of the world, it was like he owns like a ton of camels, right? He has just a whole bunch of camels, right? And for them, that was a lot. But when you compare it, right, in this part of the world, like there was no sciences. These people didn't have access to the sciences. They didn't have any universities. They didn't have any observatories, right? So there was no big scholarship, nothing, no one trying to discover the truth of the world around here, right? Outside of maybe some meditative sect type people. But obviously over there in the empires there was, right? So it's key to know that the people in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and where he was, and in that time period, this was not an educated, literate society. They did not have access to the sciences. And like most people in his time, the Prophet, peace be upon him, he was illiterate and he was uneducated. And this is not in dispute by anyone, because even the people who have negative things to say about Islam, they spend all their time criticizing Islam, they will use the fact that he was illiterate as a point against us. But I will show in this presentation, obviously, why that is actually a point in his favor and our favor, peace be upon him.
Okay, so I don't think, do you feel like we need to touch how Muhammad become rich and then got all those camels stuff, or you just like to focus on like how so-called man who wasn't able to read and write kind of makes strong claims about brings strong informations about Quran to the universe so that everyone can be convinced that Quran is from Allah?
Yeah, I guess we can touch a little bit on how he got all of that wealth. It was all from good, honest, hard work, as long as you consider raiding, stealing, conquering people and taking their stuff good, honest, hard work. Because Muhammad's armies, once he got a sufficient following, primarily by promising people access to war booty, he had an army ready to go and take people's stuff. And that's what they did. And 20% of it went to Muhammad for his distribution. To be fair, Muhammad didn't necessarily keep all of that 20% for himself, but it was his right to do with it as he pleased.
What are your thoughts on how Mecca was rich?
Well, my personal opinion is that it's an entirely invented story about Mecca being the trade capital of Arabia. It doesn't really seem to hold up to scrutiny. But the story goes that Mecca was this great trade city, and there lots of trade was going through the city, and as a result, they're kind of naturally getting wealthy. And Muhammad was supposedly a trader. This is actually very relevant to his claim about Muhammad being illiterate. If you want to put my slide back up, he said that.
I'm just a bit disappointed. So he introduces himself as convert to Islam for a couple of months now. And he talks about like how Muhammad couldn't read and write, yet he kind of produced amazing informations for humanity. Yet he didn't even, I'm just talking, not looking from the historical perspective, but from the traditional perspective. Yet he didn't even bother to kind of look into very basics of Mecca. That's a bit heartbreaking.
Yeah, indeed. He's like, this area was very backward and ignorant. But if we believe the traditional narrative, Mecca was the largest, most important, most ancient city in the world. So you would think that would be a beacon of learning and education and wealth. But he claims the opposite about it.
Yeah.
And this is very common when people make these arguments, whether they're the mathematical ones or the scientific ones, and he does slip in a couple scientific arguments as well. They always start out by talking about how unqualified Muhammad is, and how he's totally stupid and ignorant and really not the kind of person you would expect to do anything smart. And they have to diminish their prophet to try to make it seem like a miracle. But if this was actually a miracle, if this actually comes from God, and the proof that the Quran comes from God is the things that we find in it, then Muhammad should be able to be the most intelligent person to ever live, and it would still look miraculous because God is obviously well beyond any human's capability, not just an illiterate person's capability, but any human's capability. Now, just as a point, Elijah says that no one doubts that Muhammad was illiterate. Well, actually, I do doubt that. And a lot of other people who have studied this matter doubt it as well, because he was an experienced trader. And being able to at least have basic writing skills to record contracts is pretty important in that line of work. Additionally, multiple ahadith talk about Muhammad writing, or at least imply he had the ability to write. And the word usually translated as unlettered, ummi, really means something like Gentile or outsider. So in my estimation, the early Muslims didn't have this idea that Muhammad was illiterate. Now, maybe he was, but it wasn't important to them at the very least. It wasn't some sort of argument. But then they started to encounter Christians who started to notice that Muhammad had copied all these stories from Christian literature, from Jewish literature, from pagan literature. And they're like, this isn't a prophet. This is just a guy who's repeating stories. That he's taking stuff we already know, messing it up, not even getting it right, and then pretending to be a prophet. And in response to that, Muslims reinterpreted the Quran to mean that the prophet is illiterate, as if this somehow solves the problem. Even if he is illiterate, it's totally irrelevant, because illiterate doesn't mean stupid. It just means you lack the technical ability to write. And guess what? They had things called scribes. The ahadith, the biographies, they all talk about Muhammad's scribes. So whether he was illiterate or not is totally irrelevant, but I think they came up with this idea to try to get around the very obvious fact that the Quran is copying from previous sources. And like, oh, you see, he couldn't have copied because he couldn't write. Yeah, that's it.
There is a saying in Turkey is, do you think someone who travels more knows more, or someone who reads more will know more? And answer to that question usually comes as someone who travels more will know more when it comes to storytelling skills.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And as a trader, Muhammad traveled from one place to other place and then dealt with lots of money and then met with lots of people and heard their stories. It's not that kind of complicated, someone who never bothered to pick up a book and read it to tell you one of the best stories. It's not that difficult. It's just such a shame that someone who decides to convert Islam, after converting Islam within 2 months, he decides to put a video and emphasize, oh, well, Quran is from God. Why? Because Muhammad couldn't read and write. And he says there is no dispute on this. While Muslim scholars for centuries, not like recently, for centuries try to figure out what his Ummi means.
Mm-hmm.
Not well-educated Muslim, I think.
No, and if he had come on and talked to me, I would have been generous, given that he only has a couple months of study in this, and I would have just asked him polite questions. But since he didn't want to defend his argument, now his argument is going to be torn to shreds because he didn't want to defend it, so he doesn't get to defend it anymore. But before we get to anything specific with his argument, I want to start by kind of laying the groundwork here. So this is from a book called Why Do Buses Come in Threes? This is has nothing to do with religion. It's just a book about mathematics. I read it a number of years ago, long before I even started studying Islam. And it just talks about how mathematics interacts with our everyday life. And one of the chapters of that book is called How Do You Explain a Coincidence? And I'm just going to read a little bit from the authors, Rob Eastman and Jeremy Windham. At a recent seminar on the paranormal, some adults were asked if they had ever experienced an interesting coincidence. Most of them had. One woman recounted how the previous year she had been on a holiday in Switzerland. It turned out that the family staying in the next chalet were her former neighbors from home. More spooky was the man, call him Tony, who said that as a schoolboy he had really disliked his headmaster. One Sunday night he dreamed that his headmaster had died. The next morning he arrived at school to discover that the headmaster had indeed snuffed it over the weekend. The seminar room went rather quiet after hearing Tony's story, and then someone whistled the tune to the Twilight Zone, and everyone burst out laughing. It is interesting that so many people prefer to attribute coincidences to some mystical force than to a more rational explanation. This is something to do with the human psyche. People love mystery and paranormal, hence the enormous success of programs like The X-Files on television. However, the belief in hidden forces is also partially to do with a general ignorance in society about the mathematics of chance. So the authors are basically saying that people are really bad at estimating how unlikely an event is. And I found this in my work and in more casual activities as well, that to the human mind, there's almost no difference between, say, something that's only 5% likely to happen, which is 1 out of 20, and something that's like 1,000,000 to 1 against happening. So when people, like, for example, they think about winning the lottery, they think about, it's really unlikely, but they think of it more in terms like, I have a 1% chance of winning rather than I have 100 million to 1 chance of winning. And human beings basically intuitively don't really see any difference between these, something that's unlikely and something that's virtually impossible. So this is going to be highly relevant when we look at the supposed mathematical miracles of the Quran, and I try to assign a probability of them occurring, because we need to put our intuition aside. Our intuition on things that are improbable is very inaccurate, and we need to look at hard numbers. But before we get to the Quran, I want to illustrate this with a thing that I'm going to call the miraculous birthdays. So my birthday is September 20th. What is your birthday, Hatun?
It's in August.
So we're just going to say August 1st for the sake of argument here.
Okay.
So, wow, that's quite astounding. The odds that my birthday would be September 30th and yours would be August 1st are 1 in 133,225. That is extremely unlikely.
Brother, you are special now. So you share birthday within every one person out of 133,225. Wow, maybe Allah specially chose you.
Yeah. Now, I think that, hearing August 1st and September 20th, people are going to be like, what are you talking about? That doesn't sound remarkable at all. They're just two random days. But the odds are exactly the same, whether the days are the same or whether they are different. Now, in fact, the odds that Hatun and I would have shared a birthday are 1 in 365 days of the year, 365 possibilities. Assume for the sake of argument that they're all equally probable. There's a slight imbalance of birthday distribution, but roughly 1 out of 365. Now, if Hatun and I did have the same birthday, and you'd probably at least say that's interesting. Now, you probably wouldn't say, oh, that sounds like a miracle that two Christian apologists who criticize Islam and are on the same live stream have the same birth date. But you would at least find it interesting, even though it's 365 more times probable than us having the exact days that we do, September 20th and August 1st.
Actually, I met with a brother back in California a couple of months ago. He kind of does lots of evangelism. He used to do evangelism. His birthday is exactly the same birthday date, and even, I think also the year, with another brother who is very much involved in not evangelism, with like critic of Islam. Both of them are like born on I can't remember the date. I think it was like 14th of September. Both of them in the same year, same date. So I think like they are special now.
Yeah, I mean, just off the top of my head, being born on the same day and the same year would be, let's say, special. 60 to 70 more times unlikely. Now, if the audience can see that, why that sounds interesting, that two people are born on the same day, but recognize it as not miraculous, then we've kind of set a lower bound, right? That anything that's less or anything that's more likely than 1 out of every 365 occurrences cannot be considered miraculous by any stretch of the imagination. But let's go ahead and take this a bit further. If there's about 100 people watching the stream right now, with that size of crowd, I guarantee there's 2 people who have the same birthday. It'd probably be like 98% probable or something that 2 people have the same birthday. But let's say it was just a room of 23. That doesn't sound like very many. Well, if you have a room of 23 people, odds are roughly 50-50 that 2 of them will have the same birthday. Because each time you multiply something that's improbable, so you have 1 out of 365, or it's usually easier to look at it in the inverse. So 364 out of 365 that there's no match. And then you add another one and it becomes 362 out of 364. Still very improbable that there's a match, but then you multiply all these things together and it adds up really quickly, such that by the time you get to 23 people, it's like 50-50 odds that someone shares a birthday. But here's something quite extraordinary. This comes from the book, Why Do Buses Come in Threes? One strange historical coincidence concerns the presidents of the United States. 3 of the first 5 presidents died on the same day of the year. And that date, it was none other than the 4th of July. Of all the dates to die on, that must surely be the most significant to any American, especially a president, I may add. This might of course, be part of the explanation as to why this coincidence happened. Can you imagine the early presidents being really keen to hang on until the anniversary of independence, a date which meant so much to them, and giving up the ghost as soon as they knew they had reached it? This is apparently what happened to Thomas Jefferson, the third U.S. president. John Adams, the second president, actually died a few hours after Jefferson. His final words were, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." He was wrong. So if we look at all of the U.S. presidents that have lived to this date, who have been president and have died up until the present time, then the odds of 3 of them having died on the same day is only 1 out of 4,900. And this is especially weird because it's July 4th, the American Independence Day, arguably the most important day to a president. And if we have restricted to just the first 5, which is where all of these are shared, then it's 1 out of 4.88 million against. So not to give anything away, but we're not going to see anything even approaching those numbers in the Islamic texts. But we have a significant date combined with 3 presidents dying on that date. Unless this is miraculous, unless you're going to accept this as miraculous proof that the United States is blessed by God, that the United States is God's chosen nation, then the mathematical miracles of the Quran you should also discard, because this is better than anything that we're going to look at.
When I first heard about the mathematical miracles of the Quran, that was like back in 2015 or 16 or even 14, when Jay Smith had debate with Shabir Ali. In that debate, Jay Smith brought up problem with the Quranic manuscripts, and Shabir Ali expressed that like Quran is from Allah because of the number 19 miracle. By that stage, I never heard such a thing. I was like, what? Where this come from? And then I went to mosque following day, and then I was talking about what would you say to me if I say in Islam number 19 is miracle? And then first thing they said like, oh, Surah 19 verse 19. So they were pointing to Jesus with Surah 19 verse 19. Yeah, I can't remember if we did like this debunks on numerical miracles of the Quran, but I find it strange. According to your slide, Muslims would kind of read this slide and then they would say, well, God placed those presidents in right time and then he took their life just on right time. That's like miraculous, versus not a one word is being mentioned in such often.
Yeah. So someone just said, but Thaddeus, it's the accumulated case. And they said they were kidding, but actually that is valid. Like you can't have events that aren't improbable in and of themselves and add them up. But here's the thing, right? You need to have some criteria, because otherwise you're just playing a game here. You start with what you need to find. The 19s being one of the prominent examples, not one cited by Elijah, but being one of the prominent examples of how this works. Well, 1 out of every 19 things you try is going to be a multiple of 19 by definition. Every 19th number is a multiple of 19. So you just try things and you try, that doesn't work. Okay, you try something different. That doesn't work. You try something different. You try 19 of them, you found one example. You throw out the other 18, you never mention them again. Then you try another 19 things, and on average, you'll have found one additional thing. And this is just trying it blindly, right? This is just randomly trying things. If you already have an idea of what you're looking for, then you can go and look for that thing and say, oh, that only came up to 18. I bet you if I can find something to add 1 to it, then it will work. And then you can just easily find something that you add 1. I had a Muslim come on my channel who was very fascinated by the 19 thing. And I challenged him. I said, if I can go to the 19th chapter of the Book of Mormon and find 19 miracles of 19 in that chapter, will you convert to Mormonism? And he didn't understand the point of this. He's like, why would I consider Mormonism? That's not from God, or something like that. But the point was that if you, there are an infinite number of ways to manipulate numbers. There's quite literally an infinite number of ways I can manipulate the text. So all I have to do is keep manipulating until I find something that's 19. And I actually started doing this exercise, and with I only worked on it for one night, but within like 4 hours of trying to find this, I had already found like 7 or 8 19s in the 19th chapter of the Book of Mormon, which, keep in mind, is only a few hundred words. It's way, way shorter than the Quran, and the longer the text, the easier it is to find things. So in short, you got to have some criteria, which is why I asked Elijah these 3 questions, which he did not reply to. So I said, what would it mean if similar mathematical linguistic patterns were found in other texts? Would you be consistent and say those texts are also God's words? So if mathematics proves the Quran is God's words and the same kind of mathematical patterns are found in other works, are you going to be consistent and say they're all from God? Because if you are, bad news, I can take whatever text you don't like and I can find these patterns in it. So assuming that he caught on to that and would say no, the pattern has to be meaningful, then I'd say, okay, so if it isn't just any pattern whatsoever, how do you decide what is a miraculous pattern and what's just a coincidence? Because you can't rely on your intuition, right? As I demonstrated with the birthdays, if you choose 2 exact birth dates and already, my birth date's this and your birth date's that, it looks extraordinarily unlikely, but it's because you knew after the fact what the birth dates were. It's not like you predicted those. So we need some kind of objective criteria to establish what counts as a pattern and what's just coincidence. And then I asked him if there's something special about the mathematical things that are in the Quran compared to the essentially infinite number of things in the Quran that don't have the same kind of pattern. So one of his miracles, a very common one, is about iron. So I knew, I had skimmed the video to know what he had said in it, at least the gist of what the arguments were. I didn't need to see his exact words at that time to know, what he was, the kind of thing he's arguing. So I said to him, if iron has a pattern, why don't gold, silver, copper, and other metals also have a pattern? If there's something special about metals, and thus you can conclude something by iron having a pattern, which we'll look at later, and see if it really does have a pattern. But assuming that iron has some kind of miraculous pattern, or some unlikely pattern, I should say, how do we decide that's miraculous? Why doesn't gold and silver and copper have a pattern? If the author of the text, which for the sake of argument is supposed to be an all-knowing, all-powerful God, if he wants you to find these patterns in the text, why doesn't he put one for every single thing of the same kind so that you have a consistent argument? Instead, you have to jump from iron to the sun to water to the number 19, to all kinds of different things to try to find some pattern, because there is no consistent pattern in the Quran, as near as I can tell, and no Muslim has ever given me. Frankly, no Muslim ever will give me any answers to these questions unless they don't believe in the mathematical miracles, because once you answer these questions, they're all going to fall apart.
Okay, it might be helpful at this stage if you remind people that Quran to be from Allah, criteria is not mathematical miracles. Criteria has nothing to do with the numbers at all, because we know from the teachings of the Quran, Allah and Muhammad doesn't know that much about numbers and maths, as well as equality and multiply version of the things. Quranic criteria that this book is from Allah is, if it is not from Allah, produce something like that. So that is the Quranic criteria. It is strange that Muslims are coming up with arguments that this book is from Allah because certain words has the certain amount of numbers which is impossible to have it according to their interpretation. But brother is making a point, actually, for this to be miracle, it needs to be like proper numbers with proper miracles, not like, oh, one word is being mentioned once in the middle of the book, or one word is mentioned like equal amount of the time with the opposite side. So that's opposite word. That's not the case.
Exactly. And, these things always work on the example. Well, actually, that's not true. These things sometimes work on the example proposed. Sometimes even their proposal is wrong because they've manipulated the numbers to get what they wanted, arbitrarily discarding some instances of a word in the Quran, for example. Say, oh, that one's in the past tense. It doesn't count. But if I wanted it to count, then it would count. So sometimes they don't even work on what they're provided. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, they always work on the numbers provided. But then they don't work on anything else. And Muslims have had probably around, I don't know when this idea was first proposed. I think it was somewhere around 100 years ago. Made, of course, more famous now that people have computers and it's a lot easier to test things. But let's just say they've only been doing it for 20 years. I'm sure it's longer, but let's just say only 20 years. That's still 20 years times probably thousands of Muslims interested in this, trying different things, and anything that doesn't work is just thrown out, and only things that they think work are repeated. And then the new Muslim who is introduced to this, they only ever hear about the things that work. The person who found it, I guarantee they tried a whole bunch of things before they found something that sounded interesting. And my conclusion, go ahead.
Sorry, go on, brother. Sorry.
I was just going to say, and my conclusion, after I've run the actual probabilities here, is that they're not even chosen because they're improbable. They just are chosen because of the way they sound. They sound neat. I guarantee I could find things much more improbable in the Quran than the examples they typically provide, but they provide examples that they think sound neat because they're easy to manipulate someone with, because they sound emotional and so forth.
Yeah. I come across with the mathematical arguments by my understanding was it was from his Quran only Muslim, and as he come up with the miracle of number 19 alongside of other things, he had to get rid of 2 verses of the Hafs Quran. Like he got rid of Surah 9 verse 128 and 129 to make number 19 miracle. So people needed to butcher Quran itself to come up with their own version of the miracle. So therefore, you won't be surprised to hear, oh, they didn't use that word because it was past tense, or it wasn't meeting with their own agenda. Quran doesn't have any miracle at all, let alone mathematical miracles at all.
Yeah, exactly. Rashid Khalifa is the one who came up with the 19 miracle, and he did exactly that. He threw out 2 verses of the Quran, basically arbitrarily. He said, well, there's a hadith that says only one person was found to have those verses when they were compiling the Quran. Well, so what? There was only one person who had other verses of the Quran, and he didn't throw those ones out. And it's not just to make the total verses match up. It also ties into several of his other arguments about the number of times Allah is mentioned, I believe, and like maybe 2 of his other arguments as well. So it's absolutely crucial to his thing to throw out those 2 verses, something that no Orthodox Muslim would be willing to do.
Yeah, well, when you are desperate.
Yeah. When you don't have any historical evidence for the truth of your religion, and to be clear, history would be the proper domain to look at the truth of Islam. When you don't have any of that kind of evidence, then you're forced to come up with this silliness. So Elijah's second thing, he briefly talks about the Quran. I spared the audience of hearing him because he just kind of rambles on, doesn't really have any point. These are the 3 things that he raises about the Quran. He spends a lot of time talking about how early manuscripts of the Quran exist, which is true, but totally irrelevant to the odds of finding a pattern in the text. He talks about how it was revealed out of order, Assuming that the standard narrative is true, then that also is true, but it's completely irrelevant because the pattern is not dependent on the order of revelation. And this is a good example of how these things really work. They say something like that, which makes it seem like it's harder, right? Well, he wasn't just writing it down in order. Therefore, any pattern you find in it is even less likely to have occurred because he couldn't have done it on purpose. Well, no one's accusing him of putting these things in there on purpose to begin with. We're saying that Muslims have just found coincidences that don't have any bearing on the author's intent. Whether that author be Muhammad or it be God or it be someone else, the author didn't intend you to find these patterns. That's the reality of the situation. So it being revealed in a different order than it's written down is totally irrelevant. And finally, he says that it was revealed in response to questions, that Muhammad didn't know in advance what it was he was going to reveal as part of the Quran. Well, I would agree that Muhammad was just making up stuff in response to questions, but that, again, has no bearing on the probability of finding patterns.
It might be helpful to bring a reminder to us that yes, there are some early manuscripts of the Quran, but in still 10th century, and we don't have a Quran, exactly the same Quran what we are reading.
Mm-hmm.
There are manuscripts of the Quran from late 7th century, 8th century, 9th century, which is not complete, as well as it does not match with the current Quran Muslims are reading. That's helpful to remember. So people might say, oh yeah, I've got manuscripts, but there are other Muslims who are saying actually that is not canonized manuscript. Helpful to remember. And you can't make your mathematical arguments with non-complete and different manuscript. That just doesn't help at all. It is such a shame that this Mr. Muslim decides to do that. But as I said, when people kind of jump into Islam and then decides to justify themselves why they are into Islam, they need to butcher Islam to make sense of it.
Indeed. And I got 3 more Quran irrelevancies that I hear from Muslims, sometimes not raised by Elijah, to be clear, but other ways that people try to make these patterns sound improbable. They'll say it was written before computers, thus that a human being couldn't have easily rigged the text. Again, no one's claiming that people intentionally rigged the text. That it's written in beautiful poetry. Obviously, whether it's beautiful or not is subjective, but it also has no bearing on the patterns. Just because, say, verses rhyme with one another doesn't have any bearing on the number of times that Allah is mentioned in the Quran. And you can mention him just as many times in prose or poetry. And then sometimes they will say that the Quran is really long, thinking that this makes it harder to find patterns. So, like, it's really long. How could someone have kept these patterns, kept the numbers balanced after writing so much text? Well, I put this in red because it actually makes it easier. The longer the text is, the easier it is to find patterns because you have more to work with. So leaving all those things aside, we can get to his first argument if you want to play the next video.
Okay. Just like comment on your last 3 points.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Bible is written by 40 different people, 40 different locations within 1,400 years gap, okay? And all of those writers are pointing us to Messiah who is going to come and give himself on the cross for humanity. I would say that's a miracle. It is written before computer. It is written under the persecution. Half of the Bible is written under the persecution.
Mm-hmm.
People were given to the lions for holding the scripture, yet 40 people, 40 different locations, 1,400 years gap, and then it still screams out, Jesus Christ is crucified and risen Lord. I would say that's a miracle.
Yeah, and let me highlight the difference here, because when you're talking about the Bible and how Scripture is a cohesive whole despite being written piecemeal over time by a variety of different authors living in a variety of different places, you're looking at the actual content of the Bible. You're looking at the actual way that things like, say, the non-sacrifice of Isaac plays into the crucifixion of Jesus. you're talking about the content. You're not talking about arbitrary patterns that can be found. So for arbitrary patterns, it doesn't make any difference how the text is compiled. The odds of finding the pattern are exactly identical. You don't need to know how the text was compiled. But if you're talking about it being a cohesive narrative, then it does become harder when you have different authors working at different times in different places.
Yeah. Let me play the video.
And this first one it's proof that, in my opinion, it's proof that the Quran we have is the Quran since the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So right, here's something we should know, or at least that it's preserved, right? So, as I might have said before, the Quran has 114 surahs or sections, right? Each of which is composed of verses. If you add all surah numbers to their corresponding verse amount of verses, so for example, Surah 1 has 7 verses. 1 plus 7 is 8. Surah 2, now let me move the camera down so you can see it. Yeah, that way when I get lower, everyone will be able to see it. All right, that should be good. Surah 2 has 286 verses, so our total is 288. Surah 3 has 200 verses, so our total is 203. So with these calculations, right, so 1 is 8, 2 is 288, 3 is 203, right? You get exactly 57 even totals, and you get exactly 57 odd totals, right? So what happens when you add all of these totals together, right? So if you add 1 plus 7 is 8, 2 plus 286 is 288. Surah 114 down here I know has 6 verses, so the total is 120. If you add the totals of these 57 calculations all together, you get 6,236. Now, you might have caught this number earlier. Ink's running low. You might have caught this number earlier because 6,236 is also the number of verses in the whole Quran, right? And if you add our 57 odd totals, right? So 3 to 203, Surah 108 has 3 verses, that's 111. If you add these 57 calculations totals, you get 6,555. 6,555 is the total if you added all the numbers of the surahs together. So 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6 plus 7, all the way up to 114. If you added all of those together, this is what you would get, 655, and it's also the total of these 57 calculations of the odd total surahs, right? So if you were to remove or add a verse anywhere, or if you were to remove or add a surah anywhere in this chart, this entire system would fall apart. So let's just take Surah 1. Surah 1 is small, right? So it has 8 verses. Let's say Surah 1 now has 9 verses, right? So the first thing that would happen is it would no longer be even. So it would be over here, and we would go from having 57 even, 57 odd to 56 even and 58 odd. So our even odd balance falls apart. The total number of verses would become 6,237, and the total of these 56 even calculations would be subtracted by 9. So the total would be 6,228. So it just wouldn't match anymore. And of course, the total of the all the surahs combining would still be 655. However, you've added 9 to this side of the board. So 6,555 plus 9 is 6,564, even though the total between all the surahs combining is 6,555. And of course, if you added or subtracted a single surah, it would also mess up the 655 and then switch over. Everything would break. By adding even one verse or subtracting one verse anywhere in this chart, or adding or subtracting one surah anywhere in this chart, I just added one verse, every single part of this mathematical balance collapsed immediately. So if our Quran was off by even one aspect of this, the whole thing would fall apart.
I guess that just takes us back to time of Muhammad, where we read from Islamic tradition that Ubay bin Ka'b had different chapters in his Quran. Mm-hmm. That means he also had different number of the verses in his Quran. Ibn Masud was the same. Number of the chapters he had in his Quran were different. So it wasn't 114 chapters with 6,236 verses. Again, we look at the Islamic tradition and then we see that there is a chapter which is missing over 200 verses. So that argument just doesn't work for first couple of centuries of Islam. So I think I was right when I said like probably he picked up Hafs Quran from last couple of decades and then worked his way around that Hafs Quran.
Yeah, everything's going to be, we'll get into this in a bit, but everything's going to be from the Hafs Quran, and it's going to be on the Kufa numbering system. There are variant numbering systems. There are variant Qurans, which are not the same, right? You can use a different numbering system on the version A or version B of the Quran. So you can use any of the different numbering systems on the Hafs Quran. So it's not even just that it's the Hafs Quran. He's also picked up a specific numbering system. So the way I'm going to do this is first I'm going to analyze the claim. I'm going to see, if it's an arbitrary claim, if there's any substance to the claim itself. And then after I analyze the claim, then I'm going to try to calculate the probability, ignoring whether the claim is arbitrary or not. So my questions for Elijah or any Muslim who wants to support this, and I'm calling this the miracle of perfect balance. It's definitely one of the most popular. You'll see this from Muslims who are into this kind of thing all the time. Not always worded exactly the way he does, of course, but the same general idea that, it's miraculous that all the odd side add up to the summation of the surahs, and all the even add up to the summations of the verses, as if that there is some kind of miracle here. But my first question is, why add the surah number to the verse number? Because so he takes, surah 1 plus the 9 verses or whatever of surah 1 to get...
Sorry, brother.
To get 10, right? So why did he add those? I don't know. There's no reason to add them. To me, the most natural thing to do would be one of two things. Take all the odd numbered surahs and put them on one side and all the even on the other. Or to count the number of verses in the surah and put all the ones with odd number of verses on one side and even on the other. But neither of those things work, so you got to add the two together. But as long as you're making an arbitrary calculation of adding them together, why not multiply them together, or subtract the smaller one from the larger, or raise it to the power, or do any other mathematical function to them? Now you can't do divide because you won't get a whole number, but you can do just about any mathematical function. Why not do one of those? Well, the answer, of course, is because it doesn't work. It happens to work if you add. Then I say, why not consider other things? Like surahs have names. Why not use the name of it instead of the number? Why not count the number of words in the surah rather than the number of verses? Why not count the characters in the surah with or without white space? All kinds of different things you could do. Why are we counting the number of verses and adding it to the arbitrary number of the surah? Because really the names are primary. The names come first and the numbers are later. So why are we doing that? I don't know. Now, Elijah says if you add or subtract 1, it doesn't work. He's correct. But what happens if you add 2? If you add 2 to any number, any of the surahs on the side that tells you the total number of verses, you're still going to get the correct answer. If you add 3, not going to work. If you add 4, it's going to work again. Indeed, if you add any even numbered to any of the things on the one side on the verses side of the equation, it's still going to work. It doesn't work if you add 1 because you're changing the balance between how many are odd and how many are even. But as long as you add an even number, you're not changing the balance because all the verses stay on the same side they already are. And as long as you're adding it to that side of the equation, it still works. So one out of the 4 different ways you could add an odd to side 1, you can add an even to side 1, an odd to side 1, odd to side 2, or an even to side 2. 1 out of the 4 preserves the balance. So it's not that delicate after all. 25% of the ways you can add or subtract verses to the Quran will keep the balance in place. Now, Elijah, to his credit, he didn't argue this, but usually Muslims will try to claim that there's two miracles here. That it's miraculous that the number of verses add up and the summation of the surahs add up. Well, first of all, what is the significance of adding 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 up to 114? There's no significance whatsoever to that. The total number of the verses in the Quran, that has some significance, right? It's the number of verses in the complete Quran, pretending that the Quran is complete and ignoring the hadiths that say, let no person say he has the whole Quran, and let him say only that he knows he has what of it that he has. But even ignoring that, the verses have some significance. The surahs don't have any. But if you get the verses on one side, you're guaranteed to get the summation of the surahs on the other, because that's the total. The total is all the verses added together plus all the surahs added together. So if you have the surahs and you minus it off the total, you have whatever number total, let's say 10,000 total, you minus off, say 4,000, then the other side is going to be 6,000, which is going to be the summation of the surahs. So that's several reasons why I think this is just completely arbitrary. But then my next question is, which numbering scheme shall we use? So any comments on this before I move on to the numbering?
So let me just understand what you are saying. What I'm hearing is, first of all, you are questioning why Convert to Islam decides to add the numbers of the surahs with the verses. Why it is not multiplied or divided or other things. Why it is just like simply adding the surah numbers with number of the verses. That's kind of first question. And also you are stating, well, you can simply just add, do you call, is number 2 even or odd number?
Yeah, even. So you can add an even number, any even number, 2, 4, 6, 8.
Okay, so if you just kind of add even numbers, everything will be similar anyway. So why are you kind of not adding, like you are questioning that approach over there? I guess, like, if you are really, really desperate, so you express that he's saying after he converted to Islam, this is what he come to figure out in Islam. So he converted to Islam. Now he needs to figure out why I become a Muslim. So-called argument of Tawhid probably didn't work. Character of Muhammad is the perfect man didn't work. Now he needs to come up some kind of miraculous things to justify himself why he's Muslim at the first place, with thinking, well, as a Christian, I used to believe death of Lord Jesus Christ and his resurrection. So Quran contradicts that. Quran must be correct because history is against Quran right now. I need to find different ways to simply justify that. Therefore, he's approaching the so-called mathematical miracles. And he's also giving the image that he came out with this argument by himself.
Well, in fairness, he does say that he learned these things, but he is quite arrogant. However, he said, I found people doing this, but I couldn't find a good, concise presentation of it, so I thought I would do one. Well, his presentation is not good or concise, just from a purely media standpoint. It's not a well-produced video at all. But he states, which I didn't include, but he states in his introduction that I put this together because I couldn't find any good presentation of it that I could point someone to, kind of to do his dawah. That he just wants to say, go watch my video for his dawah.
Maybe next time he can, if he bother to listen to this, next time, instead of like having that whiteboard, just put them on a slideshow, or there is apps on the computer, you can just write on it as you are speaking. That will be better. I think because your argument is rubbish. So ideally you want your presentation to be good so people can watch it.
Yeah, exactly. And just to be clear, I did speed up his presentation slightly, and I cut out some of the either in this one, I think it was played straight through, but some of them, he goes on long asides that have nothing to do with his argument. I cut that out just for the sake of the audience, and I cut out silence. At one point, he's like, "Let me go get my eraser," and just leaves the camera running for a minute while he goes and walks away and gets his eraser. And he didn't edit any of that out. It's all there. It's just straight cut, nothing, no editing whatsoever to the video. So, I made the presentation more pleasant than it was originally.
Well, I think because, bottom line is argument is really bad.
Yeah,
Even
yeah.
though
I mean,
if he edited the video, still it wouldn't make it good. But anyway, that's what he did. So.
yeah, exactly. I wouldn't criticize him on his presentation, but his argument is crap. And if you're going to present a crap argument and brag about how you're making a video because you didn't think other people's presentation was very good, you better make a good presentation. So let's go ahead and answer that last question, which numbering scheme? So you already talked about how we don't really know how many verses or even the words of the original Quran. I'm leaving all that aside. I'm being generous here. I'm just saying, okay, we have the correct text of the Quran, theoretically speaking, and we don't know which text that is. Well, apparently it's a Hafs, I guess. But, historically, we didn't know which text that was until the Egyptians canonized it in 1924. And then the rest of the world eventually followed suit, especially after the Saudi Arabian government did it in the 80s. But, leaving all that aside, we're just going to look at the ordering of the chapters and the number of verses. We're pretending all the content's good. So this is from an Islamic website. This is not from a Christian website. It's not from someone criticizing Islam. It's from an Islamic website, islamonline.net, article titled, "How are the chapters of the Quran arranged?" They state that, but on the arrangement of the chapters of the Quran, there exist on it three opinions of the scholars. The first opinion is that it was divinely from the messenger of Allah. Second opinion is that it was the companions' effort whereby they placed long chapters at the beginning, and then it goes through a long description of how they arranged the chapters. And then the third opinion is that some chapters were arranged divinely by the Prophet, while others were arranged based on the companions' effort. This is the preferred view of most of the scholars. And then they add, whatever the case may be, the presently available arrangement must be respected because it is unanimously agreed upon by the companions after the Musaf was written by Uthman. So that first opinion, there's nothing else said about. The latter two, because they're the more probable, they give you lots of evidence for either of those opinions. Doesn't really matter because they both involve the companions. But if you want to learn more about how the Quran was compiled according to Islamic tradition, not according to me, not according to critical scholars, but according to Islamic tradition, that we're, just taking for granted because we're being generous here. This is the majority opinion of the scholars, is that Muhammad said, in some cases, this surah comes before that surah. In other cases, the companions decided what order to put them. Here's the problem. This isn't a problem for the average Muslim on the street, right? Now, parts of the Quran being lost or not knowing the words, that might be a problem. But the ordering of the Quran doesn't matter in principle. If you have all the content, you have all the content. It doesn't matter what order it is. It 100% matters if you're going to try to create a mathematical miracle, though. And it's based on the numbers of the surahs. Because as Elijah pointed out, you rearrange anything, the pattern falls apart. But the companions arranged some of the chapters. That means the companions must have been divinely inspired by Allah. That means the companions are prophets after Muhammad. Oops. In your desperation to prove Islam, you just made prophets after Allah.
So if we go with the third option, which is apparently that is the preferred view of the scholars, that a bit of the Quran is arranged by Muhammad, other bit is arranged by mankind. We are saying then current Hafs Quran is kind of has the hand of man. Therefore, Muslims shouldn't make Muslims shouldn't make any argument this is miracle because it is not from Allah. It is not organized by Allah or by Muhammad in its fullness.
Exactly. And again, If the Muslim isn't going to argue for mathematical perfection, then this isn't a problem, at least this specific thing. If they are going to make that argument, then it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
All right, so what about the verses? So as bad as the chapters are, the verses are much worse. So this all comes from a scholarly article published in Appearing Systems of the Quran by a scholar named Raymond K. Farin. So he says there's 7 classical systems, and these are described explicitly in the Islamic texts, and that Muslims themselves are discussing these 7 numbering systems in their own text and talking about them. They are labeled as Medina 1, Medina 2, Mecca, Damascus, Hims, Basra, and Kufa. The most common system today, not exclusive, but the most common system today is the Kufa system, which is where the 3236 number comes from. However, despite the Islamic texts explicitly saying there's 7 different numbering systems, no manuscript matches any of these exactly. Every single manuscript, at least early manuscripts, they all differ from one another in terms of their ordering. In slight ways, to be fair, it's not like they have vastly different numbering systems, but they vary slightly. Farin quotes another scholar named Small and says the following. Small remarks too, with respect to numbering, that none of the manuscripts he studied perfectly matches another, nor do any of them fall strictly into one of the recognized systems. So no manuscript matches another manuscript. No manuscript matches one of these systems explicitly described in the Islamic texts.
Yeah, so Keith Small talks in his book, History of the Holy Books. He goes through them and then he makes that statement. So traditionally, when Uthman compiled the Quran, when the Quran is being compiled, it was sent to the different cities with one individual who knew the Quran perfectly well. And as this places kind of received the Quran, when we look at the manuscripts, we can see actually they were different from one another. Kufa is the one where Hafs Quran comes from. Traditionally, right now, current Hafs contains 6,236 verses. But when we look at the earliest manuscripts, even like in after 10th century, we don't have manuscripts which is exactly the same with the Hafs Quran we are reading today. That is like shocking. Within like already over 300 years, and they don't have the Hafs Quran in perfect form while they were in control and in charge of all. So like just putting your faith into Islam and saying, okay, I am Muslim from now on. This is the best argument, and best argument is the mathematical miracles, the number of the verses of the Quran. Just like really, really bad argument. Like, I don't know why people don't think that. It's just bad. It's just bad.
Exactly. And worse for the Muslim trying to do these mathematical miracles, in the Islamic texts themselves, all of these numbering systems, except for Medina 1, are ascribed to a specific person, and guess what? That person isn't Muhammad. So once again, if you're using this numbering system, it is a prophet after Muhammad if you're claiming that the numbers themselves are inspired. If you're not claiming this numbers are inspired, they're just a reference system, no problem. But for any of these mathematical miracles to work, you need the numbers themselves to be inspired. At least any of the ones that our friend uses. Some of them are just counting number of words. Those ones would still work without a numbering system. But he doesn't actually use any of those.
Yeah, even today, like Muslims in Algeria, the way they count the verses are different. So is Bismillah is in the Quran or not in the Quran? Like the way they calculate is different. When you look at the different Arabic Qurans in one, let's say Quran A, chapter 5, verse 20 is different. Sorry, if you are looking at the different Arabic Qurans, want to figure out Surah 5, verse 20, in other Quran, it is Surah 5, verse 21. So 20 and 21, like there is kind of the way they calculate the Surah verses are different.
Yeah, and keep that in mind later on, because he's going to to use that fact that you can count it in different ways to his advantage in one of his other miracles, despite the fact that he claimed that this miracle proves the perfection of the Quran, that it's exactly the same as the way it was revealed to Muhammad. He contradicts himself and uses a different numbering system later on, sort of. We'll get to that eventually. Now, according to Farin's work, he believes that the Medina 1 system was probably the earliest, not the Kufa system. Let's just take a couple look at some statistics about the Kufa. So here it is compared to the other versions, the number of variants in the Kufa, as far as verse numbers, right? We're only talking about verse numbers here, compared to other versions. Between 127 and 150 verses vary in their numbering, depending on which one you're comparing it to. This is about 2% of the Quran has a different number. Now, 2% is not a lot, but remember, if you change even one verse, that it's going to mess up these patterns. So you need this system that varies between 127 and 150 verses by the other ones, or else none of your things are going to work, or at least this particular thing isn't going to work. Let's go ahead and look at this. All of the different numbering systems, they all contain some unique readings, as in there's no other numbering system of the Quran that numbers that verse exactly the same way. And of them, the Kufa has the most unique variants. This suggests that it's later and derived that from the earlier ones. Not that it was the original, but it comes later, because otherwise it would have the least number of unique readings, most likely. Now, there's a caveat here that the hymns is not known, the numbering system is not known completely because it's only known from a single partial text, so we don't actually know how many variants it would have if we had the whole Quran in that numbering system. And then finally, here's a list of in his appendix to his work, he lists all of the verse numbering variants, and this is the first page of it, so it just has the first 11 surahs. If you look through it, all of the surahs except for a couple of the really short ones at the end have variants. So every single surah, except for maybe like 5 or 10 really short ones, have a verse numbering variant. So keep this in mind. This criticism, I'm going through more details here because this applies to all of them. This applies to every numbering miracle. Anything that's based on verse number or chapter number is going to be subject to these same criticisms because there is no canonical numbering system of the Quran. There's a popular system now, but that only became popular in the last, say, 40 years when Saudi Arabia was spending huge amounts of money around the globe to spread Islam, and there was a strong pressure to conform to their standard. But in previous times, even if they're reading a Hafs Quran, right? Even if they're reading a Hafs Quran, it might be using one of these different numbering systems, or it might be using something that doesn't fit into any of these numbering systems and is unique to that particular manuscript. Because again, none of the manuscripts, early manuscripts at least, exactly match any of these numbering systems. So go ahead.
What I'm hearing from you is, since Mr. Muslim made his argument, even adding one verse will destroy all of the argument of numerical miracles of the Quran, doesn't have anything to stand on, since when we look at the different Qurans in from 2nd and 3rd century of Islam, we get to see the way number of the verses are being stated and put together are very, very much different from the current Quran Muslims are reading.
Exactly. So this is just a quick aside, but I thought it was it's not directly related to anything we're doing today, but I thought it would be very beneficial to the audience. And since it was in the paper that I was quoting, I thought I'd go ahead and quote it, because this is how actual scholars look at the textual history of the Quran, as opposed to the Muslim claim that it's perfectly preserved by oral memory. He says, with respect to this last inference, so this last inference is that the numbering system derives from the manuscript history, i.e. that it's written, not oral. He says Francois de Roche highlights in the Codex Parisino-Petropolitanus, which is one of the most important early Quranic manuscripts, a non-conforming instance, one of visual error or misrecognition. At the beginning of Surah Al-Imran, that is Surah 3, 129, the scribe writes Allah instead of Lillah. Such an error, de Roche pointed out, could not have occurred had the scribe been taking dictation or writing from memory, since the sounds are distinct and the written meaning does not make sense. Like putting in Lillah instead of Allah makes the sentence incoherent and no longer forms a complete sentence. In shape, though, the two are quite close to one another. Just a slight little turn of the hand, easy to mistake if you're looking at a visual copy. Furthermore, against the practice of writing from memory, one finds a report of Umar remonstrating against this being done by an individual in Kufa. So Umar tells someone not to write the Quran from memory or from dictation, but rather to reference the written text, according to this tradition. Additionally, writing from memory would also go against the well-attested method later of dictating from text and having the copier recite what has been transcribed for checking. So in the later Islamic texts, they describe how to make manuscripts of the Quran. And they describe how to copy a text and how to make sure that you're not making any errors while copying the text. Totally flies in the face of the desperation of Muslims claiming that the Quran is perfectly preserved from memory in contradiction to the manuscript evidence.
It is something I usually don't do it, brother, but I'm just going to pause for a second and then say hi to Adam Sika Urdi. I haven't seen him for a while, so peace of Christ be with you, brother. Hope you are well, and may Lord bless you all the work you are doing on social media as well as on other platforms, brother. God bless you. Sorry about that, brother. Didn't want to distract, but I haven't seen Adam for a while.
Amen. Yeah, amen to that. Adam is doing amazing work, and he's doing it in Urdu, which very few of us in this area can do. There's probably only maybe a dozen people total doing Urdu outreach, and it's one of the most important Muslim languages for Muslims because it's the heart language of so many Muslims. So I endorse what you said. All right, so continuing along. So I've shown that it's arbitrary. I've shown that it doesn't work because there's lots of different numbering systems, but let's ignore that and let's just calculate the probability. Let's pretend, do the most generous thing possible and assume that the Kufa numbering system is correct, that the Hafs Quran is correct, that there are no textual variants, so on and so forth. Most generous assumption possible, right? So in this scenario, the odds for there to be an equal number of odd and even number surahs, and be balanced perfectly, is 7.5%. And additionally, it's the single most likely result. Because when you have two things that are equally probable, they're going to be distributed close to being a 50-50 balance. Single most likely result, 7.5%, hardly miraculous at all. But it sounds cool. Now for the verse number match. This one's a little hard to calculate precisely, but I found someone who wrote a computer program to do a Monte Carlo, which just means a random simulation of it. And that article is called Debunking the Odd Even Mathematical Miracle in the Quran. If you want to check that out and see more about what he says. But his simulation said it's about 1 out of 170. Keep in mind that our minimum standard is 1 out of 365 because two people sharing a birth date is definitely not miraculous. So it has to be at least less probable than that. It seems really like, with the way it's described, you change even one verse, it doesn't work. Yeah, but 1 out of every 170 ways or so of randomly arranging the verse numbers of the Quran works out for the equation. And if you try 10 different ways of doing this, because remember, you can add, you can subtract, you can take just the verse numbers, you can take just the surah numbers, you can take the verse number and the name and so on and so forth. I could easily come up with more than 10 ways just off the top of my head. Do it 10 different times, you're already up to a 5.7% chance of finding it matching in one case. And lo and behold, we find it matching in one case, which seems completely arbitrary and was chosen precisely because it matched. Finally, I'll say, although I'm quite sure that the pattern isn't intentional, that the human authors of the text, because I think it's written by humans, that they didn't purposely put this pattern in, and it's just something that Muslims found because they had a 5% chance of finding it, something like this. But if someone wanted to put this pattern in, it would not require any modern computers or anything difficult. All you got to do is you arrange them in some order. You put some number of verses in there. Then you set it out in the two columns like you're supposed to do. You calculate the number, and you see how far off it is your desired result. And if it's an even number, all you got to do is add that number of verses. If it's an odd number, add one. So that'll flip one of the surahs to the other side of the equation. Once you've gotten it to an even number, all you have to do is add or subtract the number to get to your desired result. So actually very easy to do even in ancient times if someone wanted to do this. And again, I don't think anyone did it on purpose. I think it's just a coincidence. But if someone wanted to do it, they would not have to be God to do so.
So you simply debunk that argument, huh?
Yep. Yeah. I want to be thorough. I want to, analyze it in the most generous way possible, but it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And these odds that this couple somewhere between like 1 and 10% is basically what we're going to find on each of them. It's improbable enough that it seems unlikely to the human, but it's far from something that would actually be improbable, mathematically speaking. Let's put it this way. You encounter hundreds of events every single day. That means you encounter some events that are 1 or 2% likely nearly every single day. So if this is something that only God can do, it better be a lot less improbable than just 1 or 2%.
Yeah, and right now at this stage, we cannot identify this as a miracle. It is heartbreaking that someone who converted Islam a couple of months ago comes to conclusion that this is miracle. Brain cells get frozen.
So since that was the first one, I had to go through all the mathematics. The rest will be quicker. We can move on to the second one, which is the miracle of every living thing coming from water. If you want to play the clip.
This is going to be painful, people. Get ready.
The second one is about water. So we have two verses of the Quran concerning this one. So we have, I think it's Quran 21:30 and 24:45. All right. And everyone should know this, right? This is pretty common knowledge in the public schools, at least these days, is that all living things on earth, obviously plants, and then animals, and even people, even humans, right? All creatures are made of water. I believe our bodies are somewhere around 70% water by volume. And here's what the Quran says. The Quran says, do the disbelievers not realize that the heavens and earth were once one mass, and then we split them apart? Now, I've seen some commentators say that this is actually referring to the Big Bang, but that is definitely beyond the scope of this conversation. And we created from water every living thing. Will they not then believe? It says every single living thing is created from water. But the Quran doesn't say this once, it says this twice, right? So the Quran 24:45, and Allah has created from water every living creature. Some of them crawl on their bellies, some walk on 2 legs, and some walk on 4. Allah creates whatever He wills. Surely Allah is most capable of everything. Now, to my knowledge, the only way that you can know that every single living thing is made of water is if you have a microscope and you look down to the cellular level, right? Because there's no way, if you remember in school, probably in elementary school, the first time a teacher, maybe your adult relative told you, yeah, living things are made out of water, and you went, I feel pretty solid, right? Because the fact that we're all made of water is not readily apparent, right? You couldn't possibly know that. So again, unless the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the people who were with him had microscopes we don't know about in the 600s in Arabia, how could they know this unless it was divine intervention? All right. That was pretty straightforward.
Okay, according to the word of Allah, Surah 21, verse 30, Surah 24, 45. It's been expressed twice, okay? That's very important, don't forget. out of 6,236 verses, it has been expressed twice that every being is made out of water. And in 600s, Mohammed, peace, police, FBI, child protection, and all the scientific professors be upon him wouldn't know that unless Allah shared that information with him.
Indeed. So this is what we call a scientific miracle of the Quran. He focuses primarily on the mathematics, but he does throw this in here as a scientific miracle of the Quran. Hatun and I have done a couple of shows on scientific miracles before, and as it so happens, we covered this exact one, so I'll run through this pretty quickly. But if you want to look at more for my method for analyzing scientific miracles, check out that video. So I came up with 5 criteria for determining whether something is miraculous or not. First of all, it has to be true. Sad I have to say that, but often the scientific miracles of the Quran aren't even scientifically accurate. And what do I mean by true? I mean it matches current scientific consensus. Criteria 2 is that the supposed insight must go beyond what anyone could discover from careful observation with 7th century technology. Elijah claims that you would need a microscope to determine this. We'll get to that in a second. But if someone could see it with 7th century technology, then obviously someone could see it and put it in the Quran, so it wouldn't be miraculous. Criteria 3 is that it must be new to the Quran, i.e. no previous human being came up with this. Now, that doesn't have to mean that the Quran copied the previous human being, right? Maybe they did, and it's certainly plausible that the Quran copied from the pagan Greek philosophers in many cases. But even if we say that, there was no copying going on, the fact that a human being came up with it before proves a human being came up with it, which means it can't be proof that only God would know this information. Criteria 4 is the most important because this is where the miracle usually happens, that the Quran has to actually say what the apologist claims it says, because it's the miracle of reinterpretation. They'll just take a vague verse of the Quran, they'll claim that it means something, and they'll always claim that it means something that matches modern scientific consensus. So how do I determine whether the Quran actually says what the apologist claims? I look at the classic old tafsir and see if they knew it before the scientists did. And, if the Quran is stating it and the Quran claims to be perfectly clear, then I guess that, these very well-educated Muslims who are very carefully studying the text, they should come to that conclusion. And finally, it must go beyond a lucky guess. If, say, there's only 2 possibilities, it doesn't matter how improbable it was for someone to correctly determine it, because they could just flip a coin and get lucky. So those are the criteria. I'll quickly run through them, but first I want to make this comment. He says that it's beyond the scope of this video to talk about the other half of the very verse he quoted about about space and earth being joined together. And, he says some Muslims claim this is the Big Bang, but that's beyond the scope of this video. Well, how convenient that this very obvious scientific error is beyond the scope of investigation, because in no sense whatsoever were outer space and the earth ever joined as a single solid object, let alone at the beginning of time. The earth forms many years after the foundation of the universe, if we're assuming the truth of the Big Bang Theory, which is what the Muslim trying to argue about that verse must do. So how convenient. He ignores that. But this does tell us how the miracle works, and this applies to the scientific miracles or the mathematical miracles. You just ignore anything that doesn't work. You look at what you think does work, you only ever talk about that, you ignore everything else, and voila, you have a miracle.
So someone was asking if the jinns and the angels are from water. Any comments on that, brother?
Yeah, so this is a contradiction, because the jinn are supposed to be living creatures, and the Quran states they're made out of fire, which is not water.
They're not from water?
Nope.
Nope. Okay.
All right, so let's just run through these quickly. Again, if you want more of my argument, you can check out the previous video where I went through this. Yes, it's true. All living creatures come from water. There's some scientific debate whether that's absolutely necessary, but as far as we know, all living creatures are composed mostly of water. Was it observable? Now, here's where Elijah says it wasn't, right? He said they needed microscopes. I don't know how they could have done this without microscopes. Well, people in the 7th century knew that animals and plants would die without water. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out something that needs water to live probably has a lot of water inside it. And furthermore, you could just cut open an animal, cut open a plant, and lo and behold, you see liquid inside it. So there's no miraculous knowledge here. Well, what about those microscopic creatures? They're irrelevant. The Quran doesn't know they exist, or at least it doesn't say they exist, so it can't make a claim on their composition. And the author of the Quran shows no knowledge of microscopic creatures, so the fact that microscopic creatures are also composed largely of water is irrelevant.
It also might be helpful to remember as Muhammad travels with his caravans, with his animals from one place to other place. He knew the importance of water, and even probably he knew how to find it.
Yep. So then the next one is original to the Quran, and this is a big time fail on the Quran's part because Greek philosophers knew in quotes because it's not accurate, but they knew that everything was composed of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. 1,000 years before Christ, 1,600 years before Muhammad, and other cultures also share the idea. And the Quran probably believes in 4-element theory. There is a number of suggestions in the Quran that seem to suggest that the Quran believes in it, which is not surprising since it was the prevailing theory of matter during the 7th century. But being more specific, Thales of Miletus suggests that water is the fundamental element, meaning that literally every single thing comes from water. So one of the goals of the Greek philosophers was to decide which of the 4 elements was primary. Some suggested one, some suggested another. Others suggested that there was a 5th element that unified the 4 elements. This is where we get the term quintessence from. The 5th essence that unifies everything is the quintessence. So he suggests that every element comes from water. That means, obviously, if everything comes from water, then every living creature must also come from water. Again, 1,200 years before Muhammad. Anaximander writes about the same times as Thales, and he has a couple statements in his extant writing, which are just fragmentary. We don't have everything he wrote, but he wrote that we do have. He says living creatures arose from the moist element as it evaporated from the sun, and also the first living creatures were produced in the moist element. So almost exactly the same thing as what the Quran says, that all living things come from water. All living things come from the moist element, which is water. And then he even provides a mechanism that somehow the sun acts on the water, causing it to evaporate, which causes life to arise. Not scientifically accurate, but more detailed than what the Quran offers, and the same basic idea. So clearly the idea existed before Muhammad.
So what I'm hearing is you are stating that author of the Quran or the prophet of the Quran, they simply stole a false information from Greek philosophers, and then they put that information in the Quran.
Yeah, I think that they were, now to be clear, it was prevailing ideas. They probably weren't literally reading Anaximander's text, but it was the prevailing scientific idea of the day. They just took the scientific ideas of the day and said they come from Allah.
So they stole the information without checking if it is completely true or not, and then they published it in their so-called holy book. Also, I'm very much aware of there are certain Muslim missionaries out there who simply says like, okay, scientific arguments are rubbish. We cannot use such arguments to make a point that Quran is from Allah.
Yeah, and I would agree with them. I think that this is a poor argument. If by some horrible coincidence I was forced to defend Islam, I would not use a scientific argument because I think they are terrible.
Okay, so that means Mr. Muslim needs to come up with new arguments why he decided to be Muslim, besides like making this stupid YouTube video to be rich.
Exactly. So we got 2 more criteria to go through quickly here. Does the Quran teach it? Now this one, you know, on the surface level, it kind of does look like the Quran says that all living creatures are created from water. However, remember, this is a contradiction to the jinns, and perhaps because of that reason, or perhaps just because they were reading the verse and trying to understand it in context, the tafsir usually actually don't say that living creatures come from water. Rather, they try to explain how the heavens and the earth being torn apart or separated from one another has to do with the second half, that all living creatures come from water. And they suggest, as Ibn Kathir here does, that the heaven and earth were joined together. When they split open, then the sky was created, which brought forth rain. Now, this sounds strange, but a common belief in ancient times was that the earth was surrounded by water, and that's why the sky is blue. So they imagined that when the heaven and the earth are split, as Allah claims that he did, that creates a hole that causes rain to come on the earth, and then this rainwater kind of spontaneously brings about life. So it's not that living creatures are composed of water at all. It's that the splitting of the heavens and the earth caused rain to fall, which then caused life, is the way the tafsirs generally read it. And finally, we have to ask, is it a lucky guess? So that depends what we're looking at. If we're assuming 4-element theory, well, I guess you really only have 4 choices or some combination of those 4 choices. But let's be generous and say you could say any random thing. You know, all life comes from sticks. All life comes from tomatoes. You know, whatever. Well, then you have a large number, and we can give it a pass on the lucky guess. But the conclusion, nonetheless, is the same, that there is nothing miraculous about living creatures coming from water. Yes, the science is correct, but it was easily observable even in the 7th century. It was well-known information at the time of the Quran. It was the prevailing scientific theory, which was incorrect, but it was the prevailing scientific theory. And the later discovery of microscopic creatures, although Elijah tries to make a big deal out of it, is actually irrelevant because the Quran makes no mention of them. And it could, if it wanted to, it could say something like, behold, there are animals smaller than your eye can perceive. That would actually be somewhat interesting claim by the Quran. And very simple to make, somewhat interesting claim. I mean, I certainly could imagine a human being guessing that. I wouldn't say that it was proof, but I'd say it was at least interesting. Quran makes no such claim. Makes no claim about tiny creatures. Therefore, you can't say anything about them being composed of water as evidence. So let me upload the next video. So we'll move on to his next one. Since I ran through that one.
We are going through clips from the video, which is titled "A Convert to Islam. Proves that Quran is from God within 45 minutes. We are just looking at the certain segments of the video to make a case. Actually, that is not true. Quran is not from Allah, and the arguments this Mr. Muslim uses have nothing to stand on. Shall I put the clip on the screen, brother?
Yes, go ahead. I'm not 100% sure I uploaded the right one, so if it's the same one, then stop it and go to the next one.
Let's see.
One is about bees.
Okay, good.
Specifically, the female bees. And we have Quran 1668 and 1669. And I will read these both as a single passage. And your Lord inspired the bees. Make your homes in the mountains, the trees, and in what people construct. And feed from the flower of any fruit you please, and follow the ways your Lord has made easy for you. From their bellies comes forth liquid of varying colors, in which there is healing for people. Surely, and this is a sign for those to reflect. Just as an aside, we do know now that, as this verse of the Quran states, that honey has healing properties. People use it for medicinal purposes. But that's actually not the miracle that I'm focusing on, right? So something else. everyone knows at this point, I believe, that honeybees, so the bees that go out, the worker bees that go out and they collect honey and they come back and they construct the hive and they do all the work in the hive, are female. The male bees are drones. They kind of just sit around at home all day and they eat and they take up space, right? But the workers are female. This was first discovered in 1637 by Richard Remnant. He was an English nobleman who wrote a paper I put in the description. It's in Old English, but you could probably still read it. And he's the first one to say that worker bees are female. Before he wrote his 1637 paper, everyone in the world thought the worker bees were male. And another common belief is that the leader of the hive, the queen, was actually a king. So they believe that hives were ruled by kings and the workers were male, until Richard Remnant proved otherwise. However, let me show you something. So in Arabic, words are gendered, nouns are gendered, right? And the things you use to describe those nouns are also gendered. If you're from Texas or you're from like a border state, you're probably familiar with this in Spanish. So I'm looking at a chair right now, right? Chair in Spanish is silla, right? So silla is female. It means chair, right? The chair is in the feminine. So if I was to talk about this chair in Spanish, right, everything that I say would have to be in the feminine form. Otherwise, if a Spanish speaker was here, they would look at me like I'm crazy, right? It doesn't make sense. It sounds crazy if you speak about it in a way that is in the improper gender. So it's the same. So in Arabic, here's a few words from this passage. So we have the word eat, if you remember the passage. We have follow the ways. And we have its bellies, or bellies. Now, I don't speak Arabic, but I'm going to pronounce these as best as I can. So cool is the transliteration, right? So this is Arabic for eat in the male. Kuli this is the female version of the same word. Eat male, eat female, right? Follow the ways. We have sluk for male and slukki for female. And then we have butanihim for male, for bellies. And then we have butaniha. If you speak Arabic, I don't care how bad I'm pronouncing it. For female, right? So what we find in the Quran is that in all three of these cases, in these two passages, when it's describing the bees who go out and they collect the honey and they go to the flowers of the fruits and then they build the hives, they do these constructions, right? Every single way it describes them, it uses the female. Now here's my question. Is there some way that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, 1,000+ years before these extremely wealthy scientists, noblemen in Europe discovered that honeybees are females, is there some way that he could have known that? Did he have the time or the energy, or did anyone have the time to work on this and see that worker bees are female? Like, no, nobody knew this. The whole world thought they were male for 1,000 years. But here in the Quran, it describes them, the worker bees, as female. And how did they know this without divine intervention? It's impossible. They could not have known this. Just like with the water example.
So here we have our second example, our third miracle, our second pseudo-scientific example. This will be the last scientific. The remaining ones will be mathematical. This one's kind of a hybrid, half science, half grammar, I guess. But I'll analyze it using the scientific criteria. So if you want to put the slide up, or if you have any initial comments.
No, I was just like thinking, how would you feel if I just expresses this argument, just like convince me so much? I am about to take my shahada. If this is the reason someone becomes a Muslim and tries to use that stupid reasoning as a justification, all I can say, like, people really, really enjoy being in hell.
Yeah.
Like, how stupid you need to be, this stupid.
I can't imagine being impressed by this one. Like, even on the surface, it sounds stupid. Like, there's literally only two genders the bee could be, male or female. So why exactly is it miraculous? Pretending for a second, because it is very much pretending, that the Quran is saying something about the gender of bees. How would getting the gender right be miraculous exactly? I don't know.
I remember I had a similar conversation about this in a mosque. And when I first heard, like, he was saying, like, oh, workers are female bees. Only thing was in my mind was the reason in the Quran, Allah puts woman in the house, and the job of woman is like produce food for the husband, clean the house, and then produce babies for the husband. That's all I thought. Like, I wasn't thinking about like bees are the female bees are the ones like who are working. All I was thinking is, yeah, they use the similar argument and then put the woman in the house as a prisoner, and then man can just like sit back and then wait for woman to produce food, work, clean the house, and then make babies. That's all I was thinking when I first heard. Now I am like, I think stating heartbroken or heart crushed is like even so light. Hearing someone becomes a Muslim with this stupid argument.
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree with you there. Actually, I hadn't considered that, but that's actually a very, again, pretending that the Quran actually makes that claim, that would be perfect, because that's exactly what the female bees do, right? They tend to the hive, they produce the food, they have the same role as human females in Islam.
Yeah, I'll become, yeah. I think this argument will make me Muslim. Yeah, I just thought, yeah. From now
All
on,
right.
call me Muslim with Muslim name. And then every time when you
So,
say my name, just make sure everyone knows I become a Muslim from this argument.
okay. Yep. I'll let everyone know that the miracle of the Arabic grammar for female bees is what convinced you of the truth of Islam.
Yeah.
So he said, aside that we now know that that honey has healing properties. Well, aside, the healing properties of honey were well known from ancient times. And incidentally, Muhammad messes them up in the hadith. He tells people who have diarrhea, I believe, to take honey, which would actually make it worse. So he doesn't even know what the correct healing properties of honey are, apparently. But here's a better aside. Bees don't make honey in their bellies at all, in any sense whatsoever. It's just a plain scientific error of the Quran, undeniable. Because bees have a specialized organ to collect nectar, and then the nectar is deposited in the hive, and the honey is made in the cells of the hive by a fermentation process. So there is no sense whatsoever in that bees make honey in their bellies. But the author of the Quran thought that bees produce honey in their bellies just like cows produce milk in their bellies. Not really accurate either, but it literally comes like the verses come side by side. He's drawing it. He's saying, cows produce milk in their bellies, bees produce honey in their bellies. This is the wisdom of Allah, and he's wrong. And bees don't do that. Additionally, the verse says that bees eat fruit, which is not technically an error, right? The bees will occasionally eat small amounts of the fruit juice from fruits, but bees primarily eat pollen. That's their main food, and that comes from flowers, not fruits. So the author of the Quran doesn't really question. This one's questionable. I wouldn't call this a scientific error per se, but at best he's imprecise in explaining where bees get their food from.
Don't we have also writings talks about how honey was making people drunk? Like I read in somewhere it was talking about because people had honey, they ate honey before they went to war. They were so drunk they lost the war. Not sure like how in this occasion it is for healing purposes. For me, it is just making you ill purposes, especially in early days.
Yeah, it does have some antibiotic properties, which wouldn't be from eating it. Like you could smear it on a cut and it would inhibit bacteria growth to a certain extent. But again, known from ancient times. But let's look at his actual claim. He said that was just a side and not what he was focusing on. So we'll leave that there. Is it true that worker bees are female? Well, genetically speaking, this is true. There might be like some weird fringe cases, but genetically, yes, they're female. I say genetically because they don't produce offspring in most species, and so they're only kind of sort of female. They're kind of asexual, but genetically speaking, they're female. Was it observable? Well, not directly. You couldn't directly observe whether the bee has a Y chromosome or not. But there is a vast difference in appearance between a worker bee and a drone, which is a male bee. So it wouldn't be hard to guess, because sexual differentiation, that is, observable differences between the sexes, is very common in animals, occurs in most animals, in fact. So if you observe that the drones look different than the worker bees, you're probably going to conclude that all the worker bees are one sex and all the drones are a different sex. Then the question, is it original to the Quran? Now, Elijah claimed that no one before 1637, I believe is what he said, had ever made this claim, which is just flat out false. First of all, the argument is really grammatical, and more on that on the next point. But it's really just a property of Arabic grammar. It has nothing to do with any claim of the author of the text whatsoever. It's just the way Arabic grammar works, that the word is feminine. And since the word for bee is feminine, and Arabic has subject-verb agreement, the verbs are feminine too. So even though the words he pointed out have two forms, they're inheriting the feminine form from the bee, which is always feminine. Incidentally, Hebrew also uses the feminine form for all bees. All bees are feminine in Hebrew, which means the worker bees are feminine in Hebrew. It's not like the Quran says that the drones are male. It just supposedly says that the workers are female. And in Hebrew, unlike Arabic, this is actually quite rare. Hebrew in general doesn't use feminine forms for animals, but for bees it does. So it's kind of, I'm not arguing that there's anything miraculous about Hebrew, but if you wanted to argue that, then it's kind of more miraculous for Hebrew, since it is actually rare there. And in Sirach 11:3, which Protestants do not consider part of the Bible, just to be clear, but it's a Hebrew text, it says, "The bee is small among flying creatures, but what it produces is the best of sweet things." Look, it's describing a worker bee, that it produces sweet things, kind of similar to what the Quran says. And it's using a feminine form for bee because it's always a feminine form in Hebrew. Same thing as what happens in Arabic. But even more explicitly, we don't need to rely on just grammar. We can look at something that actually states that worker bees are female. In the writing of Aristotle, a couple hundred years BC, so close to 1,000 years before the time of Muhammad, there are two kinds of rulers. But some, he's describing bees, right? To be clear, when he says there's two kinds of rulers, he means of bees. But by some, they are called the mother bees. So, i.e., some call the ruler of the hive the queen, because they consider it a female, as if they were parents of the rest. And they argue that unless the ruler is present, drones only are produced, and no worker bees. Others affirm that they have sexual intercourse and that the drones are males and the bees female. Bees is standing in for worker bees. So there's two kinds: the drones, which do nothing useful, and then the regular bees, which are the workers. So drones are male, workers are female. Correct information from Aristotle, explicitly stated. And then he tells you how he made this determination. The bees have a sting, which the drones have not. So he looked at the bees. The worker bees have stingers, the drones don't. He decided there are different genders, and he assigned the female gender to the worker bees, and he did so correctly. So here we have the same miracle explicitly stated, not just based on grammar, but explicitly stated by Aristotle 1,000 years before Muhammad. All hail the prophet of Islam, Aristotle.
Let me just express it once again. If your argument that why you are Muslim and how Islam is from Allah or Quran is from Allah depend on the worker bees to be female, I am afraid to tell you, you are intentionally making your way to hell. That is seriously very, very stupid argument.
Indeed, indeed. You know, if I was going to cite, so he cited 2 scientific miracles. If I was going to cite 2 of them, I guarantee one of them would not be the bees, because of all of them, this is pretty much the stupidest stuff. So let's finish it up. So does the Quran teach it? Well, Elijah debunked himself. He said he doesn't know Arabic. If he knew Arabic, he would have known that he debunked himself, because he describes Spanish, and he says that a Spanish speaker, if they describe chairs as masculine, would look like an idiot who doesn't speak the language. Lo and behold, Arabic is the same way as Spanish. Nouns have gender. The bee is a feminine noun. And now some nouns have both a male and have a masculine and feminine form, but bee only has a feminine form. And because you have subject-verb agreement, because you have noun-verb agreement, the entire sentence is going to be written in the feminine when the subject of that sentence is a bee. So the bee's belly is written in feminine, the bee is going out is written in feminine, the bee gathering stuff is in feminine, the bee making honey is in feminine. That's all it is. It's just a property of the grammar. And to prove this, we look at the tafsir. Ibn Kathir, he doesn't think there's anything significant about the gender of the bees. Al-Tabri also doesn't mention gender. And Al-Qurtubi, he mentions the gender, and he says to his audience, who probably doesn't know Arabic as well as him, that the reason the bee is feminine is because of the Hijaz grammar. He says explicitly that the only reason bee is feminine in this passage is because of grammar. It has nothing to do with anything else. Qurtubi gets it right. Elijah the convert gets it wrong because he doesn't know Arabic. If he used his brain, he would have thought, oh, maybe the same thing that I know about Spanish is going on in Arabic, but sadly he didn't do that.
Well, it is not surprising to meet with Muslims in 21st century who claims to know much more than early Muslim scholars.
Yeah, it's odd how the perfectly clear Quran was not understood by any Muslim, even those studying it studying in great detail, writing thousands of pages of commentary. They didn't see any of these meanings that the modern Muslim just thinks is obvious in the text. Let's go ahead and finish this off. Does it go beyond a lucky guess? Well, there's only 3 possibilities for the worker bees, pretending again that the verse actually makes a claim about worker bees. They could be female, they could be male, or they could be mixed. Given that there's sexual differentiation, it's probably all male or all female. So we have a coin flip, and that is apparently a miracle that only Allah could produce, is a 50-50 guess being correct. So our conclusion, of course, no miracle here. Science is correct, but could be reasonably guessed by people in Aristotle's time, as Aristotle himself demonstrates. And more importantly, the Quran is just following Arabic grammar. If this is a miracle of the Quran, then it's a miracle of literally every single Arabic word that every single Arabic work that mentions bees makes the same claim as the Quran does. So they're all miraculous works that could only come from God, apparently.
No miracle to me this.
All right, so we're ready for the next video clip if you'd like to bring that up.
Yep. Please, people, get ready for the pain and suffering.
Fahrenheit 0 is arbitrary. Celsius is the freezing of water at 0.
Could you pause it for a second?
Kelvin is 0.
Sorry, brother?
So I forgot to explain that he starts with a lot of background about explaining how temperatures work. So I only included a tiny little bit about that, but you'll see why that's relevant later on. It's part of his argument, so I included it.
Yeah, so if anyone is curious to kind of watch the full video, please go and watch the full video. I am sure this new converted Muslim will appreciate the viewers. People usually enjoy being famous. So please go and watch the full video. But as you do that, make sure you've got enough painkiller with you, because it was very painful. I couldn't watch it all. So let's listen it again.
Kelvin is based on 0 is arbitrary. Celsius is the freezing of water at 0. Kelvin is 0. Kelvin is based on the way God made the universe, because the baseline of Kelvin, the 0 of Kelvin, is the lowest possible temperature in the entire universe. So it is based on his creation, right? So Kelvin is not arbitrary. Remember that. Surah 57. Iron. And in the surah called Surah Iron, we have verse 25, right? Verse 25 in Surah Iron is actually the only time in this entire surah that mentions iron. But as we'll come to see, the naming is very apt, right? So I'm going to read this verse to you. Indeed, we sent our messengers with clear proofs, and with them we sent down the scripture and the balance of justice, so that people may administer justice. And we sent down iron with its great might, benefits for humanity and means for Allah to prove who is willing to stand up for him and his messengers without seeing him. Surely Allah is all-powerful, almighty, right? There's a few things about this. So this surah is in the middle of the Quran, right? So if you take the number of surahs in the Quran, which is 114, and you divide them by 2, you get 57, right? So in the middle of the Quran, iron 57, this is the name, right? So it's in the middle. You should also know that Earth's core is made up of an iron-nickel alloy. So iron is in the middle of the Quran, and then iron is in the middle of the Earth, right? How deep in the middle of the Earth? Iron, the iron inner core, is 5,100 kilometers approximately deep, right? And the iron in this core starts to boil at 5,100 Kelvin is the boiling of this iron. Now, I put a chart in the description that numbers each and every Quranic verse, right? This verse 57:25, which mentions iron, which its surah is in the middle of the Quran, is exactly the 5,100th verse of the Quran. This is the 5,100th verse of the Quran in the middle, and the iron core, which it is named after, is 5,100 kilometers deep, and it melts at 5,100 Kelvin, or it boils at 5,100 Kelvin, right? But that's actually not all that there is to this one verse, right? So all the elements that the whole universe is made up of, so we have hydrogen, we have helium, we have iron, right? They have a number, I believe it's in the top left, and that number is the number of protons that it has, right? It's the number we identify it by. So for example, hydrogen has exactly 1 proton. If an atom has 1 proton, it is hydrogen. Likewise, iron has 26 protons. If an atom has 26 protons, that atom is iron. And to get the isotope, to figure out what the isotope is, you add the number of neutrons to the number of protons. So hydrogen 3 has 1 proton, it always does, and it has 2 neutrons. Hydrogen 4 has 3 neutrons. Hydrogen 5 has 4 neutrons, and on and on and on and on and on. This defines the isotope, right? So if you remember our verse, right, it was 57:25, right? Now, iron has 26 protons. By definition, an atom with 26 protons is iron, right? Now we could say, oh man, look how close it is, right? It's 1 number off. But in the Quran, and this is how we know, in 113 of the 114 surahs, there's an extra introductory portion, which is not a verse, but it is part of the surah. It's a portion of the surah, it's just not a verse. It says, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It's an intro, right? So, counting from the intro, which is part of this surah, Surah 57 has one. This is actually in the 26th part of the surah. So even that lines up, right? So we've gone over a lot of it so far, but there's actually one more thing to this verse. So we talked about isotopes, right? And there are 4 naturally occurring, which means they appear in nature, isotopes of iron. They are 54, 56, 57, and 58. All right? So these 4 are stable isotopes. Or so we thought. So according to a study from the University of Novi Sad in Yugoslavia in 1998, with a certainty of 68%, Iron 54 is only observationally stable, right? So what does observationally stable mean? Observationally stable means it is radioactive, but it is only radioactive on an extremely long time scale. These three, iron 56, iron 57, and iron 58, these are the only three truly stable types of iron, isotopes of iron, right? So you'll notice that we have 56, we have 58, and in the middle of these three, in the middle, we have 57. Iron 57 is in the middle of our list. Just like iron 57, the surah is in the middle of the Quran. Just like the iron nickel alloy is in the middle of the earth. 5,100 kilometers deep, 5,100 Kelvin starts to boil, just like our the number of our verse, right? And that verse is in the 26th portion of that surah. How did every single one of these things, every single one, all of them match up?
How did they match up? It's a complete mystery.
I can't. You know, like sometimes I think some people kind of really don't have brain capacity to understand very basics. And sometimes I think, well, we might have some technical issues from this side because my guest just left. Sometimes I think some people don't have the brain capacity to understand very basics. Sometimes I think certain people kind of try very hard to be stupid. But sometimes I think some people are being paid to be stupid. So I am really kind of thinking right now, this new Mr. Muslim who has been Muslim for 2-3 months by the time he put this video together. Brother, your devices is not connected. Sorry, my guest just left on me. Brother, if you are able to hear me, it tells me your device is not connected. So at this stage, all I'm thinking is this Mr. Muslim is being paid to be stupid. Because seriously, if those are the reasons that you are Muslim and you are trying to justify this, it is really no good, really no good. You kind of worked very hard to make your way to hell. And it seems by putting this stupid video up, you are saying, yeah, I love to go to hell. And I don't want to be a hope breaker, but in hell, there is no ice cream, there is no sunbathing. Hell is pretty hot. Hell is pretty hot. And my guest officially left me. I'm guessing there are some technical problems from his side. I'm just going to give him a couple of seconds to, not second, maybe like a few minutes for him to kind of try to come back. Options are, he said, even though I wanted to talk about this video, a convert proves that Quran is from Allah within 45 minutes. I cannot take this anymore. And his brain frozen and he decided to walk on me. Or other option is he didn't say inshallah when he jumped into the live stream and he got jinns stepped in and then took him away. I don't know which one, but where did you go, brother? What is wrong with you? Why would you leave me? And now you are talking to yourself. I can't hear you. Let's do sound check again, brother.
Testing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you are back.
Yeah, it crashed on me there, and I dropped off, and then when I tried to connect again, it wouldn't reconnect the camera, so I had to unplug the camera, replug it in, and restart the browser, and now it's working.
Well, welcome back. All I thought was, I was saying very nice things about you, which I didn't even verbalize those things, but I was saying very nice things about you. And also I expressed probably it was the jinns who came and stole you away. And you fight it against them and you are back. Water versus fire, water win.
Exactly. Yeah, the jinns should be pretty easy to overcome, right? Because we're all composed of water and the jinns are fire, so we just
Yeah,
pour ourselves
just
on
pour
them.
the water on the jinn and you won the battle.
So this is probably the longest segment of the video. I removed long portions where he just goes on and on explaining science, not really making a claim about the Quran. It's
Yeah.
probably about 20 minutes of the 45 minutes, maybe a bit less. So apparently this is his most important argument, or at least the one that has the most details to it. So we have a lot to talk about. The last one's pretty short, so if you can bear it through this one, you can make it to the end. So the first thing that he claimed is that 0 Kelvin isn't arbitrary. Well, he's sort of correct there, that it's set to absolute zero. He describes it as, I don't think it was in the portion that I clipped, but he describes it as like the lowest possible temperature, which is kind of true. It's really the point at which the fundamental particles cease moving, so that there is no rotation of atoms and such. I think theoretically the temperature can actually be less than absolute zero, but regardless, let's just say that it can not get any lower than absolute zero. And to be clear, this is all theoretical because it can't actually be reached in the real world as far as we know. But so zero might not be arbitrary, but every single other number on the scale is. So if he's going to say, Allah is measuring in Kelvin, which didn't exist at the time the Quran was written, but if he's measuring in that because it's not arbitrary, well, it is arbitrary because Kelvin's system is quite literally just the Celsius system minus a fixed number of about 273 plus 273. So negative 273 Celsius is 0 Kelvin, just an arbitrary manipulation to make 0 equal what we call absolute zero. But every single other number, the difference between, say, 100 degrees and 200 degrees is equivalent to the difference of 100 degrees difference in Celsius, specifically, 373 and 473. But it's the same scale. Like there's the same distance between numbers, which is completely arbitrary. There's nothing that says 1 degree of temperature is this. And in fact, there's another system that is also as unarbitrary as Kelvin is, which is called Rankine, which just does the same thing with Fahrenheit that Kelvin does with Celsius. It adjusts the Fahrenheit scale such that 0 is absolute zero, and then all of the numbers after that have the same degree difference between a degree as Fahrenheit does. So first point, there's nothing about using Kelvin that's special. It's just an arbitrary temperature scale like any other arbitrary temperature scale. Second, the verse is about iron being sent down, possibly from heaven. This is a different scientific miracle that Muslims claim, that the Quran knows that iron comes from outer space, even though most of it doesn't. But it's being sent down in some form. It's clearly describing iron that is on Earth. So why does he jump to talking about the Earth's core? Well, because it's in the middle of the Quran, apparently. So we're supposed to look at the middle of the Earth, except he doesn't actually look at the middle of the Earth. He looks at a boundary between the inner and outer core. So he's not even really looking at the middle of the Earth. And the verse has nothing about the middle. There's nothing in any of Surah 57 about being in the middle of the earth or anything like that. If Allah was designing this as a code we were supposed to be able to detect, why didn't he call it, why didn't he say the iron has been sent down and is found in the center of the earth? That's certainly something a person in the 7th century could write. They wouldn't, because they wouldn't know that the center of the earth was filled with iron. Indeed, the author of the Quran doesn't seem to think the earth has a center at all. He seems to think it's a flat earth. So no justification for talking about the Earth's core. Reminder, first we're talking about all the reasons why this is arbitrary rather than how the math works. Point number 3, it's not the middle verse. There is no middle verse of the Quran. And Elijah actually understands this when he's trying to make the middle iron, because I think it was in the portion I cut, but he says at one point, with 4 numbers, there is no middle. Well, with any even number, there is no middle. There's no true middle. So there's 114 surahs. There is no true middle surah. You can say either that the middle is 57 and a half, or you can say both 57 and 58 are the middle, but you can't say that 57 is the middle because it's 114 divided by 2. That is inaccurate. It is not the middle. So it's only kind of close to the middle. Well, I mean, it is close, right? I shouldn't have said kind of close. It is close to the middle, but it's not actually the true middle of the Quran. If Allah wanted to make a miracle about it being in the middle, he could have put an odd number of surahs in his Quran. But who cares anyway? There's nothing special about being the middle surah. Why not the middle verse? So if it's supposed to tell us what's at the center of the earth, why isn't the middle verse of the Quran about iron, or the middle word about the Quran iron, since the core is mostly composed of iron? And no reason. It just works here if we're sort of in the middle surah and it's sort of about iron. See also the previous criticism about chapter ordering, right? So we don't know what the original order of the surahs was. So any miracle that relies on the aura of the surahs can't be a miracle. All right, let's continue on because he said a lot. There's more stuff to say. He makes a claim about 5,100 kilometers. Now he said you can't use Celsius because it's an arbitrary temperature scale. Well, kilometers is certainly an arbitrary distance scale. There's nothing inherent in the universe about 1 kilometer. Why does he use kilometers? Because it works, sort of. It doesn't really work, but it sort of works. The center of the Earth is not 5,100 kilometers. It's not close to 5,100 kilometers. It's 6,370 kilometers, give or take a couple. So it's not the center of the Quran for the center of the Earth. It's the center of the Quran, sort of, not really even the center of the Quran, because in my opinion, the center of the Quran should be the center word, because that's not arbitrary. Verse numbers are arbitrary. Chapter numbers are arbitrary. Middle word is not arbitrary. That's what the real center of the Quran should be. That word should be iron. It's not. But even in his arbitrary system of pretending this is the middle of the Quran, it's the wrong number. 6,370 is the middle of the Earth. So what is 5,100? Well, it's sort of the boundary between the outer and the inner core, which is actually 5,150 kilometers. So he said it's approximately 5,100. Yeah, it's approximately 5,100. I can give you that. But it's a miracle of mathematical precision that's only approximate. And why that random point? And well, first of all, it's somewhat arbitrary to say that there's this boundary point, because it's not really like an absolute boundary that if you could generate dig down to the center of the Earth, ignoring all the pressure and heat problems of doing so, it's not like you'd see a wall, right? That you could tell that one layer had stopped and the other had begun. So it's somewhat arbitrary. There is a real difference, but it's somewhat arbitrary where you decide the exact boundary is. And why that boundary? Why not the boundary between the outer core and the continental crust, or the mantle? Why not the boundary between the mantle and the continental crust? Why not any other boundary? Well, because this one works, sort of. So that's why that one's picked. Not because it has anything to do with the surah, not because it has anything to do with the center, but just because it sort of works. Now, what about that temperature? So I already criticized the temperature from him claiming that Kelvin is somehow special. I pointed out that the distance is only kind of close. What about the temperature? Well, the temperature, it turns out, is very much unknown. The temperature at which iron melts, he says boils, it actually melts. That's trivial. And he just said the wrong word. I'm not going to focus on that. But the temperature at which iron melts in the core is very much a matter of debate. It's an important number because it has very important implications for the Earth's rotation, for the way the physical properties of the Earth interact with one another. It's a very important number. Scientists are very interested in that number, but it's very much an uncertain number. So I have 4 peer-reviewed scientific articles published in well-recognized journals, and they all come with 4 completely different numbers. So this one from Science here, published in 1987, says 6,350 plus or minus 350 kelvins. And then you say that's 1987. Our knowledge has advanced since 1987. Fine. Here's a 1994 article published in Science. This one says 4,800 plus or minus 200 kelvins. Completely different number. Even the ranges that they give themselves don't overlap. Actually, I read a pinned comment from Elijah. A bunch of people pointed out that the boiling point of what he calls boiling point, which is really the melting point of iron, is wrong in his video. And he referred to this scientific article, which is 2004, so more recent than the 2 I've cited so far, which is where he got the number from, or whoever really came up with this got the number from. It says 5,100 plus or minus 500 kelvins. So there's the number, but it's plus or minus 500. So that's 1,000 degree range. And for this precise number, which again, other studies disagree with, and just to prove the point, here's a even more recent study from 2011, and it actually came with a completely different number, saying 6,700 kelvins plus or minus 200. So the reason they come to such different numbers is because they're making different assumptions about the amount of pressure. So the pressure is going to determine the melting point. Not to go too much into the science, but every element, we think that, like, say, for example, we think water freezes at 0 Celsius, boils at 100 Celsius. That's only at sea level. If people who camp a lot and go up in a mountain will know this, that water boils more easily at low pressure, just like every element. The lower the pressure, the lower the melting point. Since the pressure is extremely high at the center of the Earth, the melting point is much higher. I think I saw someone point out that the melting point of iron is like 1,500, 1,600 degrees, and that's at normal atmospheric pressure at sea level. But at the center of the Earth, the pressure is much, much higher, so the melting point is much higher. Well, no one really knows what the pressure is, so they're making different assumptions about the pressure, and then doing experiments where they have these fancy devices that allow them to greatly enhance the pressure and thus calculate what the melting point of iron is at that pressure. But since no one knows what the pressure is, no one knows what the melting point is either. So we really have like a 1,500 degree span. Not very impressive that the Quran happens to be in that. Summarizing up the information on temperatures here, there's no consensus in science about the temperature. Even the source that Elijah's claim relies on gives it plus or minus 500 degrees Kelvin, which is a massive range. And why the temperature that it starts to boil at? Everything else is about the middle, right? It's about the middle of the boiling, the middle of the Quran. Or I'm sorry, it's about the middle of the Quran, the middle of the Earth, sort of. So why not the middle of the boiling range instead of the start of it? We don't know. Because, well, actually we do know, because that's the number that he thinks works. And it's not the middle of the Earth again. It's that boundary point. At the middle of the Earth, the temperature is going to be even higher. Again, we got the verse number problem. But it's even more severe here, because here he wants to count the Bismillah. So it's not the 26th verse, it's the 25th verse. He said, that's okay. We can just count the Bismillah when we want to. Remember his first claim, if you add one verse anywhere, it destroys the perfect balance. But hey, if you need that extra verse to make the number match up, no problem. And again, see previous criticism about the verse numbers not being known, not being revealed by Muhammad, being arbitrary, and so forth. Then his last claim is that iron 57 is the middle iron. Well, his basis for discarding iron 54 is insufficient. For all practical purposes, iron 54 is stable. It is theoretically radioactive at extreme time scale, but saying at extreme time scale is not correct. And that's what he says, right? And so the theory is if you observe it long enough, you'll be able to see it. The way radioactive decay works is it's decaying always, right? So, you say uranium, something that people is well known for being reactive. It's always decaying. And the half-life determines how long it takes for half of the particles in a given sample to decay. So what the real problem isn't that we can't observe it as long enough timescale, it's that our instruments aren't sensitive enough to measure the radiation. But again, for all practical purposes, it's stable. In the estimated history of the universe of 16 billion years, it would have almost no decay. And iron 54 is way more common than iron 57 or 58. So from an Earth's perspective, it very much is significant. However, I will throw him a bone here because he says there's 4 naturally occurring isotopes. He's wrong. There's actually 5. There is a trace amount of iron 60, which is radioactive and decays rapidly. So that in that case, 57 would actually be in the middle. But what's the significance? Well, why do I care which isotope is in the middle? Again, the middle of the Quran is 57.5 or 57 and 58, not 57. So why in the world do I care which isotope is in the middle? If it's supposed to be telling me something about iron, it should be telling me about iron 56 because that composes almost 92% of all iron, whereas iron 57 is just 2% of iron. So if this verse is supposed to be telling me something miraculous about iron, it should be in Surah 56, not 57. And if Allah wants Surah 56 to be the middle surah, then he can just subtract 3. There could be 113 or 111 surahs, and then 56 will actually be the middle surah. No fudging necessary. So this is just failing on every possible angle. Do you want to add anything to that before I talk about the probability of this prediction?
No, I'm just like so shocked by it. I'm like speechless, brother.
Yeah, and this iron is, so there's 3 that are popular. There's the 19s, there's the odd even miracle that we looked at first, and then there's iron. Those are the 3 that I hear time and time again. Any of the other ones of these, it's very rare that it comes up. These are the 3 most popular, and iron doesn't work. None of it works. Everything's close. None of it is exact. And yet, this is supposed to be the mathematical precision that demonstrates that only God could have made this, and it just gets it kind of close, which is going to tie in directly to our probabilities here. Since none of the numbers actually match, we have to give ourselves a range when calculating the odds. So if it's plus or minus 1 surah, then we have to give ourselves 3 out of the Quran's 114 surahs, not just 1. In the case of the melting point, it's up to 30% off. 30% of the Quran. Now, I'm just going to lay out a rule here, but if something's 30% probable, that is probably not miraculous. That's probably something that you can do every day. Hey, if you roll a dice, you have a 16.6% chance of getting any number. Why don't you just go ahead and roll a dice until you get a 3? Oh, look, it's a miracle. It was only 16% probable that I rolled the number 3. Obviously, this is just stupidity. It's just chosen because the number looks kind of cool, that it's exactly 5,100 kelvins, even though it's 5,100 kelvins plus or minus 500. Not actually, even in the article cited. Furthermore, iron's mentioned 6 times in the Quran, not 1, just not any number, but 6. So if it's mentioned 6 times and there's nothing special about the other 5, we only look at the one that matters. Now we have to give ourselves 6 chances to match everything. So we have 6 times it's mentioned, plus or minus 1,600 verses for the 30% allowance there. That encompasses 95% of the Quran. So it's 95% probable that iron would be mentioned in the vicinity of this temperature, even if we pretend there's something special about this temperature. Similarly, if 57 is close enough, we have to give ourselves plus or minus 1 surah for all 6 occurrences, and 2 are in consecutive surahs, so we don't actually have 18, we just have 16. 16 out of the 114 surahs, 14% chance of a match. Even the distance, which kilometers is completely arbitrary, but it was off by 50 kilometers, so we have to give ourselves plus or minus 50 verses. That gives us 10% of the Quran. So iron, very popular. This is one of the most popular. The best of the coincidences with iron is a 10% chance. Hardly something I would consider miraculous, something I could easily generate myself in, about 2 minutes of effort.
So I was thinking, as you are kind of telling me how so amazing this iron is, and it's in the middle of the Quran apparently stuff. Why do you think like Allah didn't even tell Muhammad when Muhammad was conquering and taking people's stuff? Muhammad was hunting for like money and gold, all those kind of things, instead of hunting for iron.
I don't know. And I also don't know why the other metals mentioned in the Quran, why they don't have any mathematical miracles surrounding them. Gold is considered the most important metal in most of human history, and there's nothing special about gold in the Quran, so why iron? Well, actually, I will throw the Muslim a bone that the Quran's claim about iron is that it's sent down so that people can make weapons, because waging war is very important in Islam. So iron is actually very important in Islam. And
that point, yeah, I missed that point. Yeah.
These mathematical miracle people, they'll never mention that, probably because they want to pretend that the Quran is very peaceful. But actually in the Quran, iron is very important because it allows you to make weapons. And that's actually true of the ancient world as a whole, that iron is very important because it allows you to make weapons that are way stronger than any other weapons that could be made at the time period. Armies that have iron weapons will destroy an army that does not. 100% guaranteed.
Yeah, and remember, it was sent down. Okay, just remember that, people. It was sent down. Okay, so we are kind of going through the arguments which is done by a gentleman who decided to become a Muslim, and after becoming a Muslim, 2 months after he became a Muslim, he decided he needed to make a case to prove Quran is from Allah. He spent approximately 45 minutes to do that case. We are just going through and trying to figure out how like really, really bad cases, those cases. I think, is this the last video, brother?
So this will be the last argument, and then he has a couple closing thoughts, which I also clipped because I wanted to comment on those.
I am very much aware that some of you finding this session is suffering. That's okay. We've got a king of universe who suffers with us in such occasions. Hold tight. Let me play this one.
First time the sun is mentioned in the Quran is 2:258. And the last time it is mentioned is 91:9. Now, something to get out of the way here. If you go online and you look up a translation of the Quran and you look for the word sun, a lot of the English translations will say that 2:187 of the Quran is the first time that the sun, it'll say sunset in that verse if you look it up in English. This is not malicious on the part of the translator. They're doing the best they can to translate it to English, right? Because not everything translates exactly the same. But the word for sun in Arabic is first in 2:258. It's just that the way 2:187 is phrased, they say sunset to simplify it for the English speaking reader. So I put in a literal word for word Arabic to English translation of that surah in the description. you can read it and you can see that, no, actually the first time sun is mentioned is in 258, right? So 258 and 91:9. So this verse here, 258, is the 265th verse, right, of the Quran. 91:9 is the 6044th verse of the Quran. Now, the number of verses between these two, and how do you calculate the number of things between two numbers, right? So let's say we have 10 and we have 5, right? So 10 minus 5 equals 5. But this is not the number of numbers between 10 and 5. The numbers between 10 and 5 are 9, 8, 7, and 6. So to find the numbers between two numbers, you subtract them, and then you do minus 1. And it gets 4. So there are 4 numbers between 10 and 5, right? The number of verses between 6,044 and 265 is exactly 5,778. Now, 5,778 Kelvin is exactly the average surface temperature in Kelvin of the sun, of our sun. This is the average surface temperature. And it's the number of verses between the first and last time the sun is mentioned in the Quran. Did they set that up? Did they know? Did they have their telescopes and their their thermometers that worked across space, their infrared measuring devices? No, absolutely not. This is the most obvious. The Quran is the most obvious thing from God that I have ever seen in my life. It is literally, it's a book of miracles that we've been sent as a mercy from our Lord. That's just what it is.
It's just what it is, Hatun. You got to convert to Islam now because.
No, I'm seriously thinking about it. Like, wow. So he expressed he wasn't Arabic speaker, and then now he's making a case. This is the first time sun in Arabic is being used there. That's like amazing by itself. So within 45 minutes, he learned and then he became Arabic expert. And that wasn't enough. The language Allah fails to communicate and express to humanity is being expressed by a person who just become a Muslim for 2 months. Mm-hmm. Miracle. That's a miracle. I'm not sure which version of Shahada I should be saying, though.
Yeah. Mystery. So this one is rather obscure. I'd never actually heard this particular mathematical claim before, having heard dozens and dozens of these things. I'd never heard this particular one before.
There was a reason for that, because people knew that was like worse than rubbish.
Yeah, and when we look at just the probability, this is going to actually be the least probable of the ones we looked at. But it's very obvious on the surface that it's stupid. And, why are you counting the number of verses between the first and the last occurrence? Totally arbitrary. If you want to put my slides back up here. So several points. As usual, I'm going to discuss whether it's arbitrary or not first, and then calculate the probability, assuming that it's not arbitrary. So first of all, you can certainly find texts that say 5,778 Kelvin. He didn't make the number up. However, the current estimate from NASA, our best estimate right now at this exact moment, is 5,772 Kelvin. Now, why does this vary? Well, it's because the actual temperature of the sun actually varies. We can actually measure this fairly precisely based on, complex things which I don't understand precisely, but we can actually measure the temperature fairly precisely. The problem is the temperature of the surface of the sun is constantly changing. Well, first of all, it's different on different portions. So like, I'm sure many people have heard of a sunspot, which is a portion of the sun that looks darker. And that's actually because that portion of the sun is cooler. So first of all, the surface of the sun is always variant. There's not one temperature of the surface of the sun at any point in time. Second of all, even the average varies over time. Sunspots form and then they disappear because of the very complex reactions taking place. The extremely, extremely, extremely hot center of the sun, which is measured in the I want to say millions. I'm not 100% sure that it might even be greater than millions of degrees Kelvin. The center of the sun is so immensely more hot than the surface of the sun that energy is constantly trying to boil up to the surface, constantly changing the average temperature of the sun. So the number, there is no one number, it's an arbitrary number. And I'll see also my criticism about Kelvin, it's an arbitrary temperature scale as well. Now back to the Quran, why the number of verses between the first and the last? Why not minus the first from the last? Why not add them together? Why look at the first and the last and not any of the other 32 occurrences of the word sun in the Quran? Now, he is correct that the one in the earlier verse is a different word.
Sunset.
He was wrong about the translators like interpreting it to be the sun. The word just means sunset. So it is a different word. But why those particular two occurrences? Why subtract? Why not multiply, add, count the surah number, don't count the surah number, count the number of words instead of the number of verses? All kinds of different things you could do. So see my verse numbering criticism back from the first one, because all of that applies to this as well. The same criticisms apply to every single one of these things based on chapter numbers and or verse numbers. So we will now look at the probability. And we are almost done with the presentation for today. This is my second to last slide, which I lost my thing. There we go. So what about the probability? Well, if we look at just the temperature range, it was pretty close. It was like, let's say plus or minus 10 degrees, since the actual temperature of the sun varies over time by at least that amount. That gives us something in the 0.2% range, which is pretty close to the 1 out of 365, a little bit better, 1 out of 500 if we're using exactly 0.2. Again, it's give or take. So about the same odds as two people having the same birth date, which we don't consider a miracle. If we also consider the fact that the verse numbering schemes give us a more wide range, then we can add about 4% for that. So 4.2% chance for the right mix of, assuming this min-max, subtraction, not subtraction, count the number of verses in between, is the right way. But actually there's, again, dozens of different ways you can manipulate those two numbers, even if we assume that the two verses are something special about the first and the last occurrence. So I have, that's the last of the miracles. Oops, I didn't mean to stop sharing my screen. I meant to share the video. So these are some of his closing thoughts. He also explains why we should convert to Islam. I cut that part out, but this part of his closing thoughts I agree with.
Okay, let's put that up.
If you want to follow God, right, the first thing you need to do is to take this brain that he gave you, right? We're all in agreement that we were created, right? You'd be arrogant to suggest otherwise, right? You take this brain that he gave you, which is more powerful than any computer or any supercomputer, any government or any other institution on earth has ever been able to create. That's your brain. It's more powerful than any of that. Take it, what he gifted you with, and use it and think logically. And if you think logically and you look at it, the answer is obvious, right? It's plain for everyone to see.
You think about it, and
yeah, just a quick question. Just a quick question. So he's saying, like, use the brain God given to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then why is not using it for himself?
Yeah, that'd be my question as well.
Oh, okay. So we are asking the same question.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, echo his words. If you use your brain and you think logically, the answer is obvious about which religion is true. The answer is obvious about whether Islam is true or not. And the answer is no, it is not. The thinking logically about these things, doing the math, taking these claims seriously and calculating the probability, there's nothing even surprising about these occurrences. I guarantee if I took an hour and I looked for a less likely coincidence in the Quran, I could find one. And I could do that for the Book of Mormon. I could do it for Moby Dick. I could do it for literally any text ever written, because there's nothing surprising about finding unlikely things. The reason they pick the things they do to talk about aren't because they're improbable. I mean, they're somewhat improbable. They're generally in the 5% range. They're somewhat improbable, but the real reason they pick them is because they sound impressive. Saying that you added up all these numbers and it came to 6,236, which just happens to be the number of verses in the Quran. That sounds really impressive. And it tricks you into thinking that it's way, way, way less probable than it actually is. It has nothing to do with the actual probability. If we're actually thinking logically, we need to calculate the actual probabilities, and then we find they're not very impressive at all. But if we're just thinking emotionally and we're desperately looking for something to prove Islam, and we already believe Islam is the truth, and we're just looking for something, and we say, oh, how could it possibly be any other way? Human beings couldn't have known the temperature of the sun. And there's the temperature of the sun in the Quran. Oh my gosh, this is proof that it comes from Allah.
Do you remember the short clip from Muslim missionary Ali Dawa was saying, don't use your akıl, use your knuckle. Like, don't use your it's just very like someone who just become a Muslim in this video for 2 months decides to make a video, and if those arguments are seriously there to keep him in Islam or help him to hold on to Islam, I'm just like so much crushed. Like, there are better arguments someone can use to justify Islam as the religion of God or Quran as the book from Allah. Not these stupid arguments. These stupid arguments has like another level, and it is heartbreaking. Allah, who apparently creator of universe, doesn't say go and find those numbers, the numbers which people are disagreeing and trying to figure out, or count these numbers which people put together, so that you become convinced that this book is from me. Allah in Surah 2:23, bring chapter like it. Surah 17 verse 88, bring like this Quran. Surah 10 verse 37 or 38, bring surah like this. So that is the criteria of Allah. Criteria of Allah is not, oh, put those numbers together, use as a Christmas turkey or Ramadan dinner, mix match, and then here is the reason that Quran is from Allah. That's just like, seriously, if someone uses such arguments to justify their belief in Islam, I think as a Christian, we need to be so concerned. We need to be so concerned. Like how, I don't know, like how much you are paid to be stupid.
Yeah, so maybe a couple words on this video, which this is, this isn't a scientific fact or mathematical fact, but it's something I've observed. And, just from a purely objective standpoint, there are much better videos by different Muslims making similar arguments. I think that they don't hold up to scrutiny. I think that the arguments themselves are still crap, but you can find people better explaining the arguments, providing better examples, doing it in a more concise format. The reason this video went viral, and many of those other videos, they only get a small number of views. The reason this video went viral had nothing to do with his argument. It had to do with two things. One, he claims to be a convert to Islam, and I will grant that's probably true. He probably converted to Islam. I'm not accusing him of lying. And two, he comes from a Western country, i.e. he's white. And because because Allah says that Muslims are the best of all creatures, because Muslims are promised to be successful and prosperous, and that the earth is their destiny, and so on and so forth. And they look at the real world and they see that the Muslim countries are not the best countries, that they are intellectually backwater, that they are relatively poor, with the exception of a couple oil-rich Gulf states, and that Muslims do not seem to be the greatest achievers in any area of human endeavor, whether it's sciences, arts, whatever. They subconsciously, I'm not saying they do this consciously, but they subconsciously see that the Quran is wrong and that Allah's promises are false. When someone from a country that looks like they think their country should look like converts to Islam, they fawn over this person, no matter how stupid their arguments are, no matter how poorly they presented are, because it validates them. It satisfies their inferiority complex, their cognitive dissonance, where they think they're supposed to be the best of all creatures. They recognize that Westerners who are not necessarily Christians, but are coming from a Christian background, that their societies are based on Christian principles, that they are actually the best of all creatures. And granted, I would not argue that Christianity is true for this reason, but it does mean that Allah is wrong when he promises Muslims to be in this position. So when they see someone from that background converting to Islam, they're like, this proves Islam is true because the best people are converting to Islam after all. And that's why the video took off. Nothing to do with the arguments. Not really even the fact that he's converted, but the fact he comes from the United States is why people watched this video in great number.
So, I'm aware that we get to hear from Muslim missionaries, oh, another person took their shahada, another person took shahada, another person took shahada. I am very much aware that scripture teaches heart of God bleeds when people choose to walk away from him, when people choose to make their way to hell. That breaks heart of our God. But if this is the level of someone who is trying to justify why Quran is from Allah with such arguments, who took shahada, my human heart says it is not lost. But my biblical heart says this breaks the heart of God. It breaks the heart of our God to see people are just like in a level of stupidity which they are being paid to make their way to hell with such a stupid arguments to stuck in Islam. Islam is a false ideology, needs to be destroyed. Out of desperation, you bring up such arguments with the so-called miracles to make sense of Islam, and only sense it makes you, it gives us to that it is taking you to hell. And brother, I'm very grateful you went through that suffering and watched the video and debunked the video. So really, really appreciate, really grateful for that. And those of you, we've got to finish the live stream in a second, but those of you who are watching us for 3 hours, 11 minutes, 52 seconds, I am very much aware that this is another level of suffering, but I don't think, beside a reasoned answer, because he's watching this like almost second time. He watched the video full, he edited second time. This is third time he had to watch it and then make a comment on it. That's another level of suffering. And as a Christian, we are told we need to share each other's burden, and then we text them all to himself. So how much you suffer tonight, how much you are disappointed with the level of people who are taking their shahada and making their way to hell, I want you to remember one thing. Truthfulness of not only Christian scripture, but also beauty of God of Bible. Yes, we are thinking this is stupid arguments Muslims are bringing and then making their way to hell. But there is something causes those people to justify these things. I don't know what it is, but all I know, whatever that justification is, they use that justification to make their way to hell. I can say from biblical perspective, Bible says that one of the wisest men on earth, Solomon, after Lord Jesus Christ, says, above all, guard your heart. When the heart of individuals are seeking and sinking and walking away from God of Bible, they are looking for other things to justify what they are doing, why they are doing. And reality cannot change. Anyone who rejects the God of Bible, anyone who rejects the work and identity of Lord Jesus Christ is making their way to hell. That reality cannot change. They will be separated from our triune God forever. And that is painful from human perspective as well as from the godly perspective. That is very painful. So therefore, please, when you hear someone took their shahada, add those people in your prayer list that Lord will bring them back to himself. Hell is pretty serious place. If it was a place where people go and take time for a bit and then change their location, eternal Son of the Father wouldn't nail himself on the cross. It was bad place. It was awful place. Therefore, God didn't want separation from his people. God himself got on that cross, showed his everlasting love to humanity by giving himself on that cross. And the amazing thing is, we just remembered last Sunday, he walked out of that grave. And today his grave is empty. He rules and he reigns. Whatever happens in the world, Lord Jesus Christ is still on the throne. Brother, even though I know our suffering is being shared, and only it is being shared by the Son of God, no one else, not Muhammad, not Quran, not Islam, not Blackstone, only by Lord Jesus Christ. I want you to know I've got full sympathy for your pain you went through. Therefore, I'll give you last words. What are your last words? And thank you very much for joining me.
I would suggest actually doing what Elijah says to do at the end, is to use your brain, to use what God has given you. You know, sometimes even religious people, even Christians, tend to think of religion as something divorced from an intellectual pursuit. However, Jesus commands us to love God with all our heart, all our soul, and all our mind. So take what God gave you, investigate the natural world, investigate the Bible and the Quran using the proper method of investigation, the proper tool, which is historical inquiry. You know, you can do a couple other things as well, like looking at whether prophecy was fulfilled, which is, you know, it's in the realm of historical inquiry, but it's a bit different. And you can look at, you know, like the literary cohesiveness, internal cohesiveness, the logic of it. But, you know, use proper tools. Don't like invent some outside criteria. Like, oh, you know, if you minus the first occurrence from the last occurrence of this, and then you get some number, and you go and you try to find something that corresponds to in the natural world. Hey, it didn't work. You move on to something else. Oh, let's try adding them. Oh, that didn't work. Let's try something else. Instead of trying to find some weird pattern that you know, is completely arbitrary, completely of your own creation, use your intellect, investigate the truth of the matter using the appropriate tools to do so, and you will find that the conclusion is indeed obvious. Christianity has been scrutinized for thousands of years. It has been more subject to more criticism over the last 200 years than anything else in human history, and it has stood the test of time. And not only has it stood the test of time, it has come out with flying colors that are confidence in the truth of Christianity from an intellectual standpoint, not from a religious standpoint, not from a trust standpoint, not from a belief standpoint. From an intellectual standpoint, the truth of Christianity stands on better ground today than it ever has in human history, and that's because it has been subject to criticism. The Quran has not. It's just beginning to be subject to that. It is falling apart. The end is coming for Islam, at least intellectually speaking. And there will become a time where no one will try to make intellectual arguments for Islam anymore, because they will be laughable, and they will retreat to a position of, you just have to believe it, like Ali Dawah did, where you don't use your intellect, you use the words of the text. You know the words of the text are correct. You don't think about it. You just accept them. You hear and obey, and that's all there is to it. That kind of Islam, you know, that might survive. But as far as intellectually, end is coming. Most people do not want to follow something that is obviously false, they will be leaving Islam in large numbers. They already are leaving Islam in large numbers. It's up to myself, you, and everyone in the audience to bring them the truth of Christianity. Leaving Islam does not buy anyone anything if they do not come to Christ. We need to be ready to pick up the pieces with the truth of the gospel. So do that, take the information, use it, and have conversations with Muslims, and go and serve the Lord.
Thank you very much, brother. And as it's been expressed, yes, many people are leaving Islam. If you bring your attention to now, those of you who are like in early hours, to Adam Sika Urdu channel, you will see how in Pakistan there are lectures regarding apostasy. People are walking away from Islam. In this part of the world, people are giving up their brain and taking Islam on. But in Muslim majority countries, people are giving up Islam. They are picking up their brain and turning their Lord Jesus Christ. Brother, once again, thank you very much for joining me, and everyone, thank you very much for joining us in this suffering live stream. May you remember Christ crucified is on the throne, and he will come and judge the world. God bless you all. We will see you on another live stream.
God bless.